Okay, and thank you for all of you watching at home for your patience as we deal with our technical issues as we are trying to meet back in this chamber with the majority of council for the first time in a very long time. This is the council meeting of September 27th, 2021. I'm going to call the meeting to order, and as we do so, we acknowledge in the land on which we gather is the traditional territories of the Coast and the Straits Salish peoples. Specifically, we recognize the Lekwungen-speaking people known today as the Esquimalt and the Songhees nations, and that their historic connections to these lands continue to this day. Item 2 on the agenda is just approval of the agenda. If I can get a motion to approve, moved and seconded. Thank you. Any discussion? I'm just we have 2 members of council that are coming in via electronic means, so I'm keeping an eye on them on the screen. It's helpful to me if both have their video going so I can see if anybody's waving frantically to get my attention. I don't hear anybody with any changes to the agenda, so I'm going to call the question. All those in favor? Any opposed? None opposed. That carries. Thank you. We have adoption of the minutes of our regular council meeting of July 26th, moved and seconded. Is there any changes or corrections? Councillor Zelka, I think I see your hand up. Okay, thank you, Councillor Zelka. So the minutes stand as they are. Is there any other changes or corrections that people wish to make? Not seeing any. All those in favor? Any opposed? Not opposed. Thank you very much. We have the minutes of the special council meeting of September 21st be adopted. Moved and seconded. Any changes or corrections to those minutes? Not seeing any. All those in favor? Any opposed? None opposed. That carries. Thank you very much. And on to item number 4. I think we can receive all of these, all 4 minutes of the Heritage Commission, Public Art Advisory Committee, Advisory Planning Commission, and then the Public Art Advisory Committee again. Moved for all 4, seconded. Any discussion on those minutes? Not seeing any. All those in favor? Any opposed? None opposed. Those are received. Thank you very much. And thanks, we don't get to see them right now, but thanks to all the members of all those committees for doing the good work that they're undertaking. Item number 5.1, we have Rise and Reports. We can do 5.1 and 5.2 together and just say that we're rising and reporting as laid out in the report, and we can move forward. Moved and seconded. Any other discussion on the Rise and Report? Councillor Zelka, did you have your hand up? No? Okay. All those in favor? Any opposed? None opposed. Those are now on the record. And we have next Mayor's remarks, and appreciate everybody being in here. It's very nice to have the majority of councillors in chambers today. It's nice to be able to look around and see faces. I just start off really most importantly, I want to take the moment to reflect on this Thursday's National Day of Truth and Reconciliation. This is Canada's first, and I just hope that all Oak Bay residents take time on Thursday to spend time in reflection and learning. We know reconciliation is a process, and I really appreciate the efforts of members of our community, and especially our staff and council, who are working hard to find areas of shared interest and knowledge sharing. So I just want to say thank you, or Hashkasayam, I guess is probably, or Siam is the appropriate way of saying that, to all of you for the work that you're doing. I also, I guess, ancillary to that, of course, as it is a national holiday, so the hall and the Elgin Yard will be closed if people are trying to get services as well. I also just want to remind people that our budget survey is intended to be open for input from October 4th to the 24th, and obviously we touch on the asset management report in great detail later in this meeting. There's a lot of big budgetary challenges facing us as a council, and no matter what the outcome, we just really appreciate the public's input on those challenges and ways forward, and so I look forward to that feedback as well. So I look forward to seeing my councillor colleagues on Thursday at the various events that are going on in recognition of the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation. I really appreciate the time and energy that you're all spending on that matter. Moving on. Oh, sorry. So are we asking to adjourn the meeting briefly until we come back in? Okay. Sure, I think we're okay from procedurally to get through our procedural pieces, but fair enough. Come on in. And sorry, for those at home, we are just going to undertake a bit of a technical fix here to try and address the audio issues that some seem to be having on our live stream. So just bear with us momentarily. All right, I'll try. Ooh, that's nice and resonant in here now. Is that too much? I sound very authoritative. Is the audio coming through? I'll just keep talking and wait to see if the audio is coming through in the live stream. I'll just keep. Fair enough. It's not through the Zoom that we're worried. It's through the live stream that we're trying to fix the issue. So I'll keep talking. Am I getting text to tell me whether it's audible or not? All right. Okay, it sounds like we're getting the feed. Okay. Okay, so where we left this, for those following at home, we had completed the procedural pieces of items 1 through 5, right through the Rise and Reports. I'll just read you the Mayor's remarks, because I think it's probably the one piece of interest to people at home. I just want to say, I did start off by just acknowledging how nice it is. Oh, go ahead, Councillor.
I just actually got a message that the audio is still not working.
I'm going to hold until we can confirm that the audio stream is in fact working. Well, I can come closer, but it sounds very echoey in here. Is there a volume switch that we can use inside the chambers? Okay. Again, for those who are watching and are able to hear me, just stand by for a moment until we get a chance to fix. Just keep talking and talking until someone, fair enough. Nobody wants to hear that, I have to say. So, well, I will, what can I reminisce on a little bit here in terms of things that we shared. I was, yeah, I don't think there's an awful lot I have to delve into. I hope all of your various committees and things that you're all engaged with aren't as crazy busy as what it looks by the expressions on the face that they are all equally crazy this fall. By the nature of our work, it tends to be breaks taken by boards, and then is there a master volume perhaps that might be adjustable on the board? I've never seen a volume on the microphones here. Is that any better? That's all the way one way, all the way the other way. I'm not hearing any difference at all in the... We've discovered a dial on the side of these things that just before they're going to be replaced by new technology.
Hello?
Okay, I'll keep talking here just so they can test the audio as they're streaming it. What? It's not making any... Oh, you want me to turn it down or up? I can't. I'm not sure which is up or down, so I'll keep talking at the moment and seeing if that's... Okay. Okay, so is that better in terms of audio? Is that a microphone audio volume? It's strange if it's a volume for microphone. It wouldn't show in the...
Hello? Oh, that's really loud, right?
But it doesn't seem to, I'm turning it up and down here, and there's no difference in the volume coming out of my microphone. This is very loud in here. We are. So those watching at home, one of the things that we're doing that was supposed to be done by now but had component delays was to upgrade our audiovisual equipment in here that was better attuned to linking between live streams, electronic meetings, and local meetings. And this is one of the reasons why is that when we get into these hybrid situations, our system is sometimes a bit difficult to get to work right. We thought we had it, but for some reason our audio stream going home is not working. I'm curious, do we know if it's ever, did it work at all tonight, or it just has been off or quiet since the beginning? It's been off or quiet since the very beginning of the meeting. Okay, that's good to know. So it's nothing we bumped or done anything here, it's just the... And my understanding now is it's very quiet, although it's now so echoey in here I can't actually keep talking. Is that a test? I can test that again. It's still it's so loud, it's picking up in a little bit of a reverb. Is there any way to turn down the volume in the room? Okay. We're making efforts here. And again, my apologies for those sitting at home and those sitting in the room. This is never a pleasant use of time to sit here and wait for technology to get resolved. But it's been a part of pretty much every electronic meeting I've been in the last year and a half, so I guess I shouldn't be unused to it. It's true, it won't create any... We're hoping this will get resolved. I'm also... we may have to all go home and do Zoom at this. Oh, actually, we can't because we're live stream. I could stay here, and we could do the rest of it from Zoom.
So Kyle, just so you know, the sound is fine on YouTube.
Yeah. Oh, it's fine on YouTube.
So it seems to be the connection between YouTube and iCompass.
Oh. Can we put a Okay, we're trying this now to see if the volume has increased or improved.
And are they on YouTube or on the...
I just want to make sure that we're getting more than one feedback. We seem to have a resolution to the audio problem, but we're just going to wait a minute here. There's a delay in the broadcast of anywhere from 8 to 15 or 20 seconds, so we just want to make sure that the streaming portion of this is getting the audio at this point. We have it internally, but we don't seem to have it through one of the two streams. Do we have an update?
It's silent now, though. Is anybody? What kind of a delay is it?
It's...
Upwards of a minute and a half to... There's a significant delay. They can hear on the portal.
Okay.
Okay, so guys, they can hear on the portal now.
Okay. So are we okay to continue the meeting at this point? Okay. Third time's a charm if we get through this. No.
Okay, let's
Let's continue the meeting. So my apologies to all of those watching. I'm not sure what the issue was. Apparently, it was something in the bridge between our primary stream and a secondary stream. So whatever it was, it seems to be resolved, and we'll just thank the IT gods for that to happen, and we'll move forward. I was starting off to say that it's really nice to have councillors in the room, but I'm not so sure if technology glitches, if that's actually the case. It's nice to see your faces, but the struggles of the technology are certainly paramount right now. I'll do this in a little bit of a different order than I originally started to, but I just remind people that September 30th is a federal holiday, and that the Municipal Hall in Elgin Road will be closed. Want to remind people that from October 4th to 24th, our budget survey will be open and seeking public input. If you had a chance to look at the asset management report, you'll see what a big challenge we have ahead of us. If you haven't, please do have a look at that document. It's large and meaty, but very full of useful information. I just want to express my appreciation to the public who do provide that feedback. It's a way for us to ensure that we're getting a sense of community's feelings, but also the chance to catch any questions or outstanding concerns that we can help address through our consideration process. So please, if you're a member of the community, please do fill that feedback in. And last, and certainly not least, I wanted to take a moment and just reflect on this Thursday's National Day of Truth and Reconciliation. I hope that all the residents of Oak Bay take time on Thursday to spend in reflection and learning. We know reconciliation is a process, and I appreciate the efforts that so many members of our community, and especially I want to acknowledge the efforts made by this council, all members of this council, and members of staff who are working so hard to find areas of shared interest, understanding, and learning as we go forward. So I know everybody's doing different things on that day. There's a number of events happening through the community. I'm currently scheduled to attend a larger regional meeting in Colwood at Royal Beach. Acting Mayor, Councillor Appleton, will be taking responsibilities to represent the community at the local gathering, and all the members of council are attending as they see fit and appropriate. So I just want to express my appreciation to council for all the work that they're doing on that front as well. So I guess appropriately that would be Hashkasayam as a thank you. So thank you all. Next up, item on the agenda, we have item number 7, which is the Ms. Bay's third quarter council priorities update for 2021. Obviously, a lot going on here. Before you start, Ms. Bay, I think I'd just like to also acknowledge the work of council taken with partnership with staff to initiate this as one of many tools to make sure that we're as transparent as possible, keeping council updated on what's happening operationally and on our priorities, but also being able to bring forward to the public what our priorities are and where they're at in the cycle of things. So this was often a bit of an opaque process, dealt with sort of case by case in the past. So just appreciative of both council and staff of taking this initiative for that transparency. Ms. Bay, welcome to the meeting.
Such as ours,
Ms. Bay, just sorry to interrupt. For some reason, I think your audio level is coming through very low. So I just got a text from someone just saying that in yours in this room here is quite a bit quieter than my voice is, and I wonder if it's the way that that's picking up the microphone. But perhaps if we could, is it possible to move the microphone a little bit closer to the speaker?
I will do so, Your Worship. Is that better?
And if you can speak up, yeah, that's probably very helpful. Those two things together.
Okay, thank you. Should I repeat what I said, or has it been heard?
I think we'll go with the fact that it's been heard, and you can continue your comments.
Okay, thank you, Your Worship. So in addition to work on the priority initiative, staff in all departments have been extraordinarily busy. So what have staff been up to? Well, in addition to the council priorities, we've been delivering on ongoing operational services, including adjusting and readjusting to COVID-required protocols. We've been supporting community engagement with adjustments again for COVID, getting staff back into Municipal Hall and reopening in-person services to the community following the building refurbishment, preparing for a return to in-council or in-chambers council meetings, undertaking capital projects, actioning council resolutions. And I'll just stop here to note that sometimes we're able to get the council resolutions update on the same agenda as the update on council initiatives. In this case, corporate services will be bringing forth the update on council resolutions later in October. On October 25th, I believe, is the target date. In addition to that, staff have also been proactively improving internal systems and processes, always looking for efficiencies, because the more efficiencies we can find, the more work we can take on as a group. So it's been a full-on past 3 months, and the remainder of the year looks to be equally full-on as staff continue to dedicate themselves to complete Council's 2021 priorities, while simultaneously delivering on and improving all the ongoing services that we provide as a staff group. This report is before you for information. Once you have received it, staff will place the document on the district's website, where the public can find all the district's quarterly updates as well as your council priority plan. That's all I have, Your Worship, in terms of my introductory comments. I will note that directors are available to answer any questions related to the update.
Thank you very much, Ms. Bay. We're still trying to keep the audio here as effective as possible. I think, Ms. Williams, I think your microphone is now picking me up through that microphone because it's so loud in here, so you may have to be a bit careful. So I'm going to turn to members of council. I'll go to those in the room first if there's any questions, and we'll go through your questions, and then I'll go back for any comments or motions as laid out here. Actually, Councillor Zelka, you got your hand up first, so you have the floor. I think the volume could use a little louder. If you can speak a little bit louder, that would be helpful.
I'll do the best I can. I was very pleased to see on page 2 of the staff report, and also initiative number 42, a communications plan was prepared that resulted in an absolutely excellent rollout of the public emergency system within Oak Bay. I was able to see the ads, I was able to see the work done on the website, and I was able to, basically, it was very apparent to me that some good works were done and the public was informed. It reminded me, I think it's a quote from Winston Churchill, who said, "Never let, no crisis should go to waste," or "never let an emergency go to waste." So with that in mind, I see we do have a communications plan, and maybe later on in this meeting, we might be talking about public engagement and communications plans. Is it possible staff could share that communication plan for the public emergency system with all of us, just so we could take a peek at the good works that were done for initiative number 42, please?
Thank you, Councillor Zelka. I'll leave that to staff to circulate to council, I think, so we can just take as a takeaway. Thank you. Was there anything else, Councillor Zelka? No. Okay, thank you. Councillor Appleton?
Thank you, Your Worship, and through you to staff. I just wanted to inquire briefly with respect to items around the Cool Kit program, and I do appreciate the update on Cool Kit program, and with restrictions being somewhat more relaxed, I'm looking forward to actually getting together with members of the public and getting started in earnest on that. I was just wondering whether staff might be able to comment on one of the associated recommendations from the Community Climate Action Work Group was with respect to the community funding package associated with not directly with the Cool Kit, but community grants for climate action. And I understand that some of that work's been set aside or delayed just because of operational considerations, and doesn't necessarily appear on this because the funding has been rolled into the ongoing budget. But I was just wondering whether staff might be able to comment on sort of the status of that, the logistics around the grant program and kind of what was visioned as next steps. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Appleton. I'm going to go to Mr. Anderson, I believe would be the appropriate person for that, but if not, then I'll let the appropriate director jump in.
Thank you, Your Worship, members of Council, and Councillor Appleton. Yes, I can update that the Climate Action Working Group recommendation number 3, which relates to preparing grants and rebates program, is underway with staff, and our intent is to bring that forward this year in this fourth quarter. With respect to recommendation number 4, around greenhouse gas emissions and existing and new buildings, we are, per Council's direction, going to be developing an RFP to retain a consultant in quarter 4 to assist us with the delivery on that Climate Action Working Group recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Anderson.
Thank you, Worship.
Thank you. Are there any other questions of staff on this report? I'm not. Oh,
I'll move that the report be received.
Moved and seconded. And sorry, Councillor Zelka, back to you. We'll just have a motion to receive on the floor, but that allows for comments or questions. Go ahead.
I did notice that the Tempest.net has been completed most likely by the IT and Financial Services Department. That was a prerequisite for, I think it's called the building permit thing. I know Victoria has one out there and probably Central Saanich, but we were waiting for Tempest.net to get in there. Could someone remind me what the name of this building permit thing where you can query any of the active building permits without having to come into Oak Bay Municipal Hall? And when will it go live?
Yeah, thank you very much, Councillor Zelka. I believe that's Mr. Anderson's purview as well, and may have an update in terms of timelines.
Thank you, Your Worship. Yes, the initiative is referred to as a development tracker. And that is the one where we have applications and we have information related to the host of land use applications, including building permits. It will be available for the public to peruse on that. And our intention is, I will say it, this quarter 4, we're going to be bringing that forward. We're hopeful that it's actually in the month of November that we're able to bring that forward, or perhaps sooner. But that's staff's intent. I hope that's helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Anderson.
I'm not promising, but I might have to buy the Building and Planning Department a beer. That would be great. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Zelka. We have a motion to receive on the floor. I don't see any other hands up on this one. I will just make a statement. Nothing on any of the pieces. It's great to get the report. It's nice to see us so on track. And I don't think Ms. Bay adequately put forward how difficult it was working out of trailers and at home and trying to have paper records stuffed away in rooms as things are getting painted and drywalled, and then finding them and digging them out in responsive ways. So it was quite a Herculean effort to make it keep the things running and to keep things on track. So I just want to express our appreciation to staff for their efforts on that, as reflected in this report. Not seeing any other hands, I'll call the question. All those in favor? Opposed? None opposed? That is received. Thank you very much, Ms. Bay, for that. We're moving on to the main item of the agenda, not to put anything away from the final item, but that is the asset management program. And I don't think I need to do much in the way of introduction to this, but I thought I would just lay out for those watching at home that if you wish to speak to this item, it is open for public input. You may do so. And so the instructions for that is on our agenda package. And you can, but first we're going to get a presentation. And I'm just going to express that if any members of council wish to ask questions as Mr. Payne and Mr. Haran are presenting the asset management plan, please do so in stream, and we'll just try and take those questions. We'll get some follow-up questions from council, if any, and then we'll go to questions or comments from the public before we come back to this table for moving direction from council. So that's the process. If there's members of the public who wish to speak, you can. It's a *9, is it, Ms. Williams, to flag if to speak? Is that correct, or how are we actually managing this on this hybrid system today? I'm more used to it under Zoom. Okay, so if you just call into the office number, is that correct? The main number, or the 1-800 number? The 1-800 number that's on the screen. Right. So the 1-800 number that's on the screen. If you call that number, we will give directions in terms of putting you in queue. But I will make that call as we get closer to the time for public input. But I'm just letting people aware. So with that introduction, which is not much of an introduction, I'm going to invite Mr. Payne and Mr. Haran and/or Mr. Haran to present the asset management plan and to take questions from council.
Volume, and let me know if that volume works for you, and I'll also share the presentation materials on the Zoom screen, and let me know if you can see that as well.
Thank you, Mr. Payne. We can hear you, I think, adequately loudly, and we have your presentation up on the screens in the room here. And just for those following along at home, that presentation should be in your agenda package as well, so that people at home can follow along in the presentation. Welcome.
Yes, thank you, Your Worship. I was also going to mention that if folks want to follow the live presentation materials, they can use the Zoom, I believe, as well. Is that correct? Can I ask that question to the Director of Corporate Services?
Yes, thank you. I believe the Zoom call is only for internal staff at this point, so it's just the live stream that people can watch. So they would have to follow along in the agenda package to see the presentation. Ms. Williams, I apparently have that wrong.
Thank you, Your Worship. You weren't wrong. There's a little bit of an additional piece. People can join the meeting by Zoom. They just need the Zoom meeting ID and the passcode that's up on the screen, and if they do that, they can then see the presentation, which will be a share screen in Zoom.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. So either way, you can follow along. Welcome back, Mr. Payne. Mr. Payne is our Director of Financial Services.
Thank you, Your Worship. Before I scroll through the slides, I want to acknowledge the significant cross-departmental cooperation that was required to put the work together. Certainly, a significant amount of input from the Engineering and Public Works Department, as well as the Oak Bay Fire Department, Oak Bay Police Department, and as well as a strong internal team of peer reviewers were able to assist in making the draft Sustainable Infrastructure Plan a success. Just a little, a little background of how we got here. Council will recall that staff was directed to develop a multi-year asset management program in 2015. And in 2018, the AM strategy was endorsed, which included multiple components. And one of the components was a long-term infrastructure replacement plan. And that's in keeping with best practice in developing your asset management strategy for local governments. In 2021, Council directed that the plan be fast-tracked and delivered by September of 2021. So here we are 3 days before the end of September. This is the first time that Council has seen this draft plan, and we do expect it to be a draft plan at this point. A document that will see many iterations. So the objectives of the plan based on current conditions were to estimate the replacement costs for all depreciable assets that the district owns or maintains, as well as forecast infrastructure spending over the next 100 years.
Sorry, if I could just ask, there's someone named okay, it's been muted now. Thank you. Go ahead, Mr. Payne. My apologies.
Thank you, Your Worship. The plan also sought to analyze current funding levels and forecast reserve balances and the need for debt financing if possible. So why was the plan prepared? It's really to ensure that critical capital services can continue into the future, so that water continues to flow, sanitary sewer and drainage systems continue to work and the roads are maintained for use by the community. Funding these capital services with a long-term view is essential to continuing those critical services through generations. So the plan was prepared with a number of assumptions that will be tested in time and will help develop the future iterations of the plan. Of course, we need to acknowledge that the plan is imperfect. There's imperfect information. We don't have complete information, but we do have a lot of information and enough to put this plan together. It's a living document, and we expect that council decision and changing conditions would change what the plan forecasts. The plan looked at existing capital only, so it did not anticipate growth in capital, which will inevitably occur in the community, but it just looked at our current stock of inventory and predicted when that inventory would be replaced and how much it would cost. All dollars in the plan are represented in 2021 dollars. If you add an inflationary component to 100 years of forecast, the numbers become sort of meaningless, so everything's prepared in current year dollars. The report was prepared in accordance with National Asset Management Standards. It's called NAMS. I may say NAMS from time to time during the presentation. Those standards were incorporated into the plan here. And in terms of climate change, the plan considered what are some possible impacts of climate change on the forecast. What it didn't consider quite thoroughly or at all would be the potential impacts of climate change on private property. And certainly the potential impacts from climate change could be extremely significant to private property. And if that were to occur, council decision-making and priorities would shift alongside that. But that's not thoroughly contemplated in this plan. What we did look at was climate change and some of the impacts that may occur to our infrastructure. The most significant, what I would say, variable that changes the forecast is council decision-making. And there is some expectation that council will be making significant changes in the coming years that would change forecasts and change conditions. For instance, land use, service levels, tax-based diversification, condition assessments that may come across our desk. All of those things will have an impact on how our infrastructure is replaced and what capital services we provide for the community. So council has significant governance input into the future of our infrastructure. Our investment returns were forecasted conservatively. Over the past number of years, investment returns have fallen significantly, and it's difficult to say what that's going to look like over the next 100 years. Your Worship, I was just going to mention that if it pleases the chair, I can stop as I go through the slides and ask if there's any questions or comments as we go through the presentation, or I can answer any questions near the end of the presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Payne. I think a brief pause is appropriate in case there's any hands up. I'll just keep an eye on. Oh, Councillor Zelka has his hand up, so I will go to him. Go ahead, Councillor Zelka.
Thank you very much, Chair. Am I loud enough?
You are, and just going to let procedurally here, Ms. Williams, if you want, I have the Zoom up here on my screen, so we don't need to see it on there if it's not necessary. I'll keep an eye out for hands. So go ahead, Councillor Zelka.
Thank you very much, Chair. A very small question. Maybe you'll be addressing this in the presentation or later on. I would love to know how risk factored into some of these numbers, and maybe you could just address that either now or as you go along, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Zelka. Mr. Payne, your call whether you address it now or later in the presentation.
Your Worship, yes, thank you for that question via Councillor Zelka. I believe a good spot for discussion on risk will be when we talk about useful life in the presentation, and you'll understand why. A useful life is essentially there's significant council decision making that relates to risk when it comes to useful life. It's the amount of life that council intends on using capital property. And so council can use discretion in determining the useful life of a capital asset to a reasonable degree. And so, yeah, we'll have a good discussion about that. I suppose it's at the end of the presentation.
Go ahead, Councillor, Mr. Payne.
Okay, so thank you, Your Worship. So I'm just going to go over some of the terminology that I'm going to go through in the presentation today. I'll be repeating a lot of these terms, and I might be repeating them quickly. And so I thought it was important to cover some of the definitions used in the plan. One of the first things that we'll be talking about is our annual sustainable infrastructure funding. That simply is defined as the total expected replacement cost of a piece of capital divided by its useful life. So again, if we have a pipe that we believe is worth $1 million and its useful life is 100 years, well, then you can do the math and determine what the annual sustainable infrastructure funding is. So it's the annual amount you should be setting aside as your assets age with time. The second piece of terminology is called our annual infrastructure funding gap. And this is the difference between the sustainable infrastructure funding, the annual sustainable infrastructure funding, and what we're actually funding. So the example in the plan, we estimate that we're funding $8.2 million annually, and we estimate that the annual sustainable funding is $12.8 million. So that's a $4.6 million difference. And that's what we refer to as the annual sustainable infrastructure funding gap. The third piece of terminology we call the sustainable reserve targets. And this is the target reserve balance that we should have if we plan on funding our infrastructure sustainably. So as an asset age, we should be setting aside funds to replace that asset, and we should peg it to how far it has depreciated. So again, if you have a piece of capital that's worth $1 million and it is halfway through its life, then the sustainable reserve target would be $500,000 because it's been half consumed.
Mr. Payne, we just have a question from Councillor Patterson.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Mayor, and through you to staff. The question is, are sustainable reserve funds booked as liabilities for the municipality here?
Thank you, Councillor Patterson. Mr. Payne?
Your Worship, through you to Councillor Patterson, in almost all cases, the answer would be no. So reserves essentially are derived from tax revenue and set aside for our own purpose. Council sets them aside generally by bylaw, but they can be rededicated. So they can be undedicated and used for a different purpose under certain circumstances. And that's why they're not booked as liabilities. If there are external restrictions on the use of the funds, then they are booked as liabilities, such as developer cost charges or other externally restricted funds. Those would be booked as liabilities.
Thank you. That was the answer I was looking for. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't see any other hands up, so please continue, Mr. Payne.
Thank you. And the last term here to note is the cumulative infrastructure funding gap. So this is simply the difference between what our sustainable reserve target is and what our actual reserves are. So again, if we have a piece of capital that's worth $1 million to replace, it's halfway through its life, then the sustainable reserve target would be $500,000. If we've only saved $200,000, then the cumulative infrastructure funding gap is $300,000. It's the difference between our sustainable reserve target and what we've actually saved. So we'll be reporting on this number as we go through the plan today. And the last term I'll just mention the difference between useful life and physical life. Physical life is how long an asset will last before it essentially fails. So a good example of this is a water main. A water main may fail after 80 years of life. Well, council may wish to mitigate the risk that a water main will fail by setting a useful life of 70 years or 75 years. And that's where the discussion about risk comes in. The engineers will provide a sense of risk of what an appropriate useful life may be, and council can use its governance discretion to set a useful life. So there is a difference between useful life and physical life, and it's important to note in the context of this report. So some of the key
Also, Mr. Payne, can I just get Councillor Patterson just had a question on that?
Yes, just perhaps, Mr. Payne, you may be able to think of a better way of explaining this, but the question that was put to me, and the way I explain it, is that the sustainable reserves is really, sustainable funding deals with the future, and cumulative infrastructure gap is really refers to the past, work not done. So really one is past and one is future. I may not be quite correct on that, but it seemed the simplest explanation I could give. You may have a better one.
Sure. Thank you. Mr. Payne, any comments on that?
Your Worship, I would say that's a fairly accurate analogy. Essentially, a cumulative infrastructure funding gap means that unless Council is able to catch up on reserve contributions, it's going to need to borrow in the future. And when you do borrow, you're kind of forced to adopt sustainable infrastructure funding, right? So let's say you haven't saved for the replacement of something such as a piece of pipe that has a 30-year lifespan. So you've accumulated $1 million in the cumulative infrastructure funding gap because it's worth $1 million. Well, you don't really have a choice as Council to not replace that capital. You have an obligation, a health and safety obligation to replace that. So you have to borrow. When you go to borrow it, you have to pay the debt servicing cost, which is equal to a sustainable infrastructure funding amount, plus interest that you pay to borrow. So essentially the difference between annual sustainable infrastructure funding is you're earning interest versus with debt you're paying interest. So a very interesting analogy I hadn't heard. I appreciate that. So some of the key findings in the report that the district owns and maintains assets that have a replacement value of approximately $900.3 million. $150 million approximately of that is land, so it doesn't depreciate. The remaining is depreciable assets that need to be replaced and that get consumed over time. According to our calculation, approximately $274 million of our assets have reached their useful life or exceeded their useful lives. And again, don't confuse useful life with physical life. If they had reached their physical life, then they all would have failed by now. But the useful life figure that we use is NAM, so it's National Asset Management System, and their recommended useful life for those assets. So we believe approximately 40% of our depreciable assets have reached their useful life by NAM standards. The calculated annual funding gap is $4.6 million approximately, so about 36%. So we're funding about 64% of sustainable levels that we estimate. So $8.2 million is what we're funding versus $12.8 million is what our estimate is. So until that gap is closed, the cumulative infrastructure funding gap will continue to grow by however much that annual funding gap is. So we estimate the cumulative infrastructure funding gap to be about $463.5 million. That's approximately due to $500 million in infrastructure that has been consumed, or a proportion of that infrastructure that has been consumed, less about $38.5 million in reserve funding that we have set aside.
I'm just going to interrupt you there for... Sorry, Mr. Payne, I just have Councillor Zelka who wishes to speak. Go ahead, Councillor Zelka.
Thank you very much, and I'm very much enjoying this presentation. This is probably as good a time as any to talk about the 12.8 million as the annual needed amount according to an accountant. Accountants are wonderful people, but I wanted to know, is this replacing like for like? So for example, if a pipe was put in 100 years ago under 1921 standards, would we be replacing it like for like to get us up to $12.8 million needed on an annual basis? Or is it considering current standards?
Thank you, Councillor Zelka. Go ahead, Mr. Payne.
Thank you, Your Worship, and an excellent question. One of the things that was integrated into our assumptions. For most of our depreciable assets, we would say like for like, but when we say like for like, we mean the same service, the same capital service. So for instance, we might be replacing clay pipe with PVC. We replace everything with PVC right now. But it provides the same water provision service to the same standard as the previous asset. It just might have a longer life or less expensive maintenance. Now, there are some assets in our inventory that have been costed as like for like, but it's unlikely that we would replace like for like. I use sidewalk as an example. We have many sidewalks that don't meet existing standards, modern standards. 1.5 meter wide sidewalks, for instance, will likely want to be replaced with 2 meter wide sidewalks. Well, we've only costed in this plan 1.5 meter sidewalks. The same can be said about roads. We have existing roads, some that don't have curb and gutter, some that don't have sidewalk. So we haven't costed the cost of replacing that road with a road that now has curb and gutter and a sidewalk. It's only been costed to replace with road. So the same service for the same service is how I would answer that question.
Thank you very much, Mr. Payne. I think that's that met the question. Please keep going.
Thank you. And yes, we've estimated approximately $1.3 billion in spending over the next 100 years, which of course is going to be subject to so many different variables, inflation, investment returns, debt interest, council governance being a big one, climate change. So, this could be $1.7 billion. It could be $1.2 billion. But it's put there for the benefit of the reader council to understand the true scale of the cost of your infrastructure over 100 years. So here's just a brief graph showing all of our infrastructure and what proportion they are. You see the majority of our infrastructure is linear assets, drainage, sanitary sewer, water, and roads make up the vast majority. We have also buildings and vehicles and equipment, park structures to a lesser extent. So the next graph that we put together just wanted to demonstrate how far these individual assets are through their useful life on average. So for instance, roads in terms of roads, we have over $170 million in roads. According to their age, they're about 79% depreciated or consumed. So once we get through that extra 20%, will be fully consumed. And that's about $135 million of roads that have been consumed. So again, if we had decided early on that we wanted sustainable reserve levels, we would have set aside $135 million in roads. And I'm sure some of these roads, some of this 79% is composed of roads that have been fully consumed. So we would have either had reserves set aside to replace those roads, or we would have replaced them because we would have had the funding. So that's what sustainable reserve targets does for you. For buildings, we're about 67% consumed, or $54 million. Drainage is our asset class that is the most through its useful life, being 85%, $122 million. Sanitary sewer, 77%, $82 million. And water, 73%, or $95 million. Now keep in mind, as I mentioned, the percentage consumed is highly influenced by the denominator, which is useful life. So again, council either indirectly or directly gets to make a governance decision that impacts risk and can extend what they expect a useful life to be. I don't believe that the District of Oak Bay has had that specific conversation, but it certainly would form part of the asset management program rollout, in particular the levels of service discussion, which the Director of Engineering and Public Works would be preparing.
Mr. Payne, I'm just going to have a question here from Councillor Patterson.
Yes, thank you, Mayor, and through you to staff. I know they're not our assets, so they're not included in this, but certainly technology has a big impact now on communities. And so I'm wondering if staff could explain how technology is taken into consideration when they're analyzing this, because I know that a lot of our roads get torn up actually to put in, whether it be cabling or new gas lines and all of those types of things. So how does that affect the planning for, because it just seems like there have been some new roads done, and then somebody decides they need to have gas put in their house, and they tear the new road up, and they put the gas in, and the road, which was substantially new, already has repairs on it.
Mr. Payne, is there any accommodation for those changes, or is that just built into the lifespan of the roads?
Your Worship, I would say that it's somewhat integrated into our unit costs, and I'll invite our Director of Engineering and Public Works to speak if he can add anything to what I would say. But for instance, there's some asset classes here there's new technology in terms of how those assets can be replaced. So you're talking pipe bursting and I forget what it's called, but Mr. Haran will know exactly what I'm talking about, where the old pipe gets sealed as opposed to having to be completely dug up and replaced. And so those type of innovations can save the district money. And so what we have done is, when we calculated the unit rates for all of these for the asset replacement, some of it does consider integration of those units. However, it doesn't substantially include an assumption of greater innovation than we already are aware of. So it doesn't include any assumption there. Mr. Haran, did you have anything to add to that?
Go ahead, Mr. Haran. Mr. Haran, for those watching, is our Director of Engineering and Public Works.
Yes, thank you, Your Worship. You can hear me okay? It's my first time talking tonight.
We can hear you loud and clear. Thank you.
Perfect. Okay, there's a lot to those questions, and there's in terms of diving into the technical aspects of it, but I'll do my best to kind of summarize. So what Mr. Payne was talking about in terms of technologies to save money in terms of rehabilitation is things like trenchless technology. So that's the pipe bursting, the pipelining, and other things like that. But then the question from Councillor Patterson about the issues with respect to roads, for example, and the in terms of having roads dug up to put in gas mains or fiber optic lines, or have people change their do some repairs. I think we've incorporated that into the big picture costs of roads over the years, because I think part of a regular road service life is that aspects of it, parts of it are dug up to do things underground, and there's really good ways to do that in the long run, and really bad ways. For example, a brand new road gets dug up to do a whole new main, that would be a bad thing. But in general, this plan is very high level. So the assumption has to be that there are many program management decisions done over the decades to maximize the use of the district's infrastructure money to be efficient. But at this point, in making longer term 50 to 100-year predictions, this is the best information we can provide in terms of unit costs and expected costs for replacements of the assets going forward.
Thank you very much, Mr. Haran. I have a question also from Councillor Braithwaite.
I got a promotion. Yay. Thank you very much, Mayor. And I think that this question probably goes to Director Payne. When I look at this, just so that I have this solidified in my mind, this is telling me, as of 2021, right now, in this moment in time, that in the red, the consumed assets that we have are $488 million that have consumed, and we have $140 still available in those assets. So if we were to try and fix all of these things today, it would cost us $488 million. Is that what I'm seeing here?
I'll go to Mr. Payne.
Your Worship, to answer simply yes. Now, just a couple caveats, if you don't mind, Your Worship. First of all, this isn't all of our depreciable assets on this graph. We also don't have park structures and vehicles. We just put the major ones. So the total amount consumed is $502 million. And so yes, to answer it correctly, if we wanted to fix everything, it would be $502 million. Mind you, much of those assets you wouldn't want to fix them because it's appropriate. It's okay to be 80% through your life, and it's still a good asset to use. However, some of those assets are beyond their useful life and would need to be fixed immediately if we wanted to have those assets remain within their useful life. The value of that is $274 million.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you for that clarification. And back to Councillor Patterson.
Yes, thank you, Mayor. This may be a question for Mr. Rand, but do we understand from the graph that is represented here what portion of these assets are in what I will define as in poor condition, and for me that means from a practical standpoint over periods of 5 to 10 years for assets identified as near or beyond expected service life and showing signs of advanced deterioration or instability.
Mr. Payne?
Your Worship, that's good. That's a good question for Mr. Haran to answer. But what I would say is that it's going to depend by asset class what information we have on condition assessment. The district has since 2015, for instance, set out on CCTV condition assessment of its sanitary, sewer, and storm main. And so for what has been CCTV'd, it's very easy for the district to answer that question and also prepare sort of a prioritized approach to replacement of those assets. Buildings is something that is visible. Water is a little bit more difficult. So the answer, I believe, would depend on the asset class.
Thank you, Mr. Payne. Mr. Haran, do you have anything to add?
Yes, thank you, Your Worship. I think a good way to think about this question that Councillor Patterson asked is that we've presented the answers to the questions about this, but there's many different views like lenses to look at it, and this is one lens, but they all kind of show us the same thing. So back in 2016, our first asset management kind of report that had to do with linear infrastructure, so the pipes in the ground and roads and so on, was showing us based on the age and the material of the assets and how much of each one of those assets, like if there's so many kilometers of water main of a specific material built in a certain year, then we made assumptions based on that to say it was going to be in poor condition or very poor condition. And the same with sanitary sewer and storm sewer. And that's a very good way to start your asset management journey to try to assess how challenging your infrastructure renewal is going to be. And then in the intervening years, we did condition assessments of sanitary sewer and storm sewer, and the data that we're having from actually looking at the pipes and seeing what's going on is that we're not too far off in terms of the, we don't have any wild changes in terms of the system is doing way better or way worse than the expectations. And then this financial analysis that's been done this year is factoring in that information that we know so far. So again, it's not perfect, and it will get better over time. And when over time, I mean as a decade passes or another decade passes. But in terms of the information we have, this financial forecast factors in everything that we know from all the different sources that the asset management program has provided for us up to this point.
Thank you. Go ahead, Councillor Patterson.
Yes, thank you, Mayor. I appreciate that answer. The reason for my question is really to try and from a council perspective determine if we are getting near to having a practical scope of information that will give us, as members of council, a reasonable 5 to 10 year plan that, I'm looking for manageable parts of this, because I think, as Councillor Braithwaite said, if you look at the red and you add up all those numbers, it tends to become very daunting. So I'm looking for breaking it down into more manageable pieces that will get us to council decisions. And we may not, the answers may be forward in in the presentation as we go along. So if that's the case, then that's fine. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Patterson. Did you want an answer for that, or just to clarify?
Well, if they're going to cover it later, I'll wait. But if it's not covered in the later part of the presentation. Perhaps we can have a brief answer on that now.
Sure. Mr. Payne?
Your Worship, yeah, we will be covering next steps near the end of the presentation, and we'll discuss at that time, how council can use its governance lens to direct staff to come back with a more manageable plan for the short term. So I think we'll get to that, and if not, we can have a more fulsome discussion at that point.
Thank you very much. Please continue, Mr. Payne.
Thank you, Your Worship. So I just wanted to give council a snapshot of the individual asset classes. You'll notice under the value consumed column, that's where that $502 million comes from that I quoted earlier, and then the reserve balance being $38.5 million. So our sustainable reserve target would have been $502 million, or we would have had a number of those assets already replaced, in which case we could have a much smaller sustainable reserve target. So it leaves a cumulative infrastructure funding gap of $463.5 million. Just a couple caveats about this slide. We have over $50 million in reserves with the district, but only 38.5 of it could be used for infrastructure replacement. The other reserves have specific uses, such as the purchase of new capital. For instance, our parkland acquisition fund can only be used to purchase parkland, so that's not a reserve we could put into this analysis. Of this $38.5 billion, approximately 16.7 of it is undedicated. So we have for instance, an cumulative surplus balance which isn't dedicated, or some of it is, some of it isn't. So we've just assumed that council could dedicate it in here for the purpose of calculating the funding gap. So we'll talk just a bit about the annual funding gap to begin with, and this is the one measure that we've been focusing on for the last couple of years in financial plans. Now we have a bigger picture to consider, but we asked ourselves, how does a cumulative infrastructure funding gap occur? And it really happens slowly over a number of years if the annual funding is less than the sustainable annual funding. And if that's the case, whatever the difference between the annual sustainable funding and our annual funding is, it just adds to the accumulated funding gap year after year. Sustainable annual funding, just as a reminder, it's just going to be your replacement cost divided by useful life. That's your annual sustainable funding. So here's an example. So assume, for instance, that we have a fire truck. I always use a fire truck as an example here, but you could really replace fire truck with pipe. The reason I use fire truck is because its useful life is more predictable, and it's easier for people to understand that, whereas a pipe can last many generations and many council terms, and so it becomes easier not to plan in advance for that. So in this case, we use a fire truck. Let's assume it cost $1 million, and the useful life of that fire truck is 10 years. Then our annual sustainable funding would be $100,000. We could either set that aside right away from year one, and then so by the time year 10 rolls around, we'll have $1 million. We could replace our fire truck, or we could set aside no money, and then when we have to replace our fire truck, we have to take on debt. At that point, we'll be paying the debt servicing cost. So you're essentially paying sustainable infrastructuring costs after the fact with a little bit of interest. So more often than not, councils have a combined approach. It's not 100% sustainable, 100% debt. Well, assume council makes the strategic decision that they want to fund unsustainably. I'm sure we wouldn't call it that if that were the case, but let's say it's $60,000 we set aside every single year. Well, the annual funding gap is $40,000, so it's the 100K less the 60K. That's the difference between our annual sustainable funding and how much we're actually funding. So the red bars on this graph demonstrate how our reserves grow. They grow to $600,000 by year 10, whereas the sustainable reserve target would be $1 million by year 10. So every year that accumulated the cumulative infrastructure funding gap grows a bit more and more. At the beginning of year one, it's only $40,000. Year two, it's $80,000. Year three, it's $120,000. That's the gap between the green and the red bar. And by the time you hit year 10, you've got a $400,000 cumulative infrastructure funding gap. So you have to find, to fund that extra $400 with debt, which you can pay for after the fact. So council has done extraordinarily well in closing the annual funding gap over the last many years. In 2017, we estimate that the annual funding as a proportion of sustainability was 31%. So we were funding $3.7 million per year. And you can see how quickly that has grown to $8.2 million, which we estimate to be 64% of sustainability. And so, in my opinion, in my experience, I would say this is the fastest pace I've seen in any local government in BC. It's possible that I'm wrong there, but I haven't seen a council increase funding at that pace anywhere. So it deserves recognition, I would say. Also, one thing I'll note in case some folks are reading our financial plan, as I mentioned, this has been our main measure in our financial plan for a number of years now. Our latest version of the 2021 financial plan estimated that sustainable funding by 2024 would be $10.4 million. Well, this Sustainable Infrastructure Replacement Plan estimates it to actually be $12.8 million. So once we've had a chance to look at the numbers in more detail, we believe this is the more accurate number, and that's why that number has changed. The financial plan forecasted that we would close the gap by 2024, but as a result of the detailed work done for the Sustainable Infrastructure Replacement Plan, that would no longer occur under current council direction. So we'll give council options as we go through the process and how fast to close that gap. Certainly the pace at which we do that, or whether we do it all in the near term, is a governance decision.
Thank you, Mr. Payne. I have a question from Councillor Patterson.
Yes, thank you, Mayor, and through you to Mr. Payne. The graph, thank you very much for this. I mean, it's a great presentation. I think it really brings a lot of clarity into some of the challenges we will be facing. But I'm just on the graph, and it's very easy to understand. I'm wondering how and when, though, we determine the impact of inflation on the reserve funds. How do we bring that into the conversation?
Thank you, Councillor Patterson. Go ahead, Mr. Payne.
Yeah, it's really an excellent question. Thank you, through your worship. Question. Thank you, to your worship. The way that we deal with inflation is what I would call forced growth. So council is probably getting used to this term, listening to me in the financial plan. Ideally, what your finance department would do would be to analyze the unit rates for infrastructure replacement yearly or every couple of years or every 5 years. And if we found that the unit rates have gone up 2% on average, then really what we're doing in the financial plan is increasing the transfer to reserve budget by that inflationary period. So it's not simply setting a target of $12.8 million. When we actually get to, 2026 or 2027, $12.8 million will mean something different because of inflation. So we will have adjusted these estimates by cost escalation accordingly, and we deal with that by applying a forced growth factor to our transfer to reserve budget. It's the same concept as when we apply a forced growth factor to the rest of our operating budget. If it costs the Parks, Rec and Culture an extra 2% to provide the exact same service because of inflationary pressures, and we increase the budget by 2%. So that's, this presentation is dealing with real dollars only, but in practicality, when we sit down and do the budget, we will have to implement the expected impact of inflation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Payne. Thank you, Councillor Patterson, for asking that question. It certainly weighs into the discussion at the end of this, where we're considering, well, not today, but in time, how much of an annual increase you want to do, because it's compounded by that cost as well. So go ahead, Mr. Payne.
Thank you. So this graph just sort of demonstrates how the infrastructure funding gap has grown over the last century. So it's certainly something that just happens gradually, and this is a natural growth that I think the vast majority of local governments have experienced. And if you're a mature community like Oak Bay, now you're under pressure to actually replace those assets, and you're faced with a cumulative infrastructure funding gap. There's other municipalities that are young, or their infrastructure is very young, and they're not feeling the pressure to actually replace those assets, and so they're therefore not feeling the pressure to fund them sustainably. So it's not a unique challenge whatsoever, as very clearly demonstrated by this graph. It's been a slow, progressive climb for over a century.
Go ahead, Councillor Appleton.
Thank you, Your Worship, through you to staff. I recognize that it's very difficult to project regressively back 50 or 60 years, but isn't it also potentially possible that this graph would almost be more exponential in its final term, sort of getting closer to the current date, just because with the expiry dates or the estimated life costs or lifespan of a lot of our infrastructure that was installed towards the 1920s to 1940s period, could we expect that this graph progresses fairly linearly, but could we also expect that might also look a little bit more exponential as it approaches the present?
Thank you, Councillor Appleton. Mr. Payne?
Your Worship, I would say the graph sort of appears to be linear. The graph is based on actual data. So we were able to actually go back and estimate when infrastructure was put in the ground or wherever. We have those records in our tangible capital asset records. And then, so for instance, if we have the records that say that something was installed in 1920 and the useful life was 80 years, well then we could see a rise in the infrastructure funding gap for that piece of asset represented in the graph. So it does kind of appear even. It's broken out by decade. But there are some differences between decades, as subtle as it may appear in the graph.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Payne. Please continue.
Thank you. So some of the key recommendations coming out of the plan is, of course, increase annual reserve contributions, preferably to sustainable levels. One of the options that is modeled in the plan is 6 years of 2.06% tax increase, which is $66 to the median residential property per year. So it would be 66 in 1 year and then 132 in the next year, because it would compound that way. But it actually basically a $66 increase every single year for 6 years. That increase would be on top of regular operating budget increases. So if you expect inflation and salary increases and whatnot to be 1.5%, that 2% would be on top of that. The pace at which we do that is certainly a governance decision and should be carefully considered by council after consultation with the public and after digesting the contents of the plan. Similarly, the water utility rate recommendation would be 8 years of 2.5%, which is approximately $10 per average residential property per year. And sewer rates 8 years of 2.5%, $7 per average residential property per year. Now, as I mentioned previously, council has increased infrastructure funding very rapidly since, starting in 2018. Council could choose to continue to increase funding even at a more rapid pace than this. Now, we modeled what that would do. The forecast indicates that we're gonna have to take debt no matter how fast we increase our annual funding. We'll likely have to take debt within the next 25 years. And so increasing the funding rapidly does decrease how much we would need in debt, because it increases our investment revenues and reduces our debt servicing costs, but not significantly. So for instance, you could increase taxes by 12.4% next year. You'd be at sustainable funding for general capital. That would reduce costs over the 100-year period by 2.2% approximately. That's because you would have additional investment revenues and less debt servicing. But it's 2.2%. So I would expect that council and the public would appreciate more of a moderated increase plan, but certainly all those options are available to council.
Thank you, Mr. Payne. Councillor Braithwaite?
Yeah, can you remind me, please, Mr. Payne, what was our prediction of what our tax increase would be before? Because we had that in a report that received last year or the year before, what our prediction of our taxes would increase for next year. Did we not?
Yes, maybe you can touch on our 5-year financial plan and the difference between the 2.06% versus the amount that we had scheduled to increase specifically for asset management.
Yes, Your Worship. So the 5-year financial plan for the next 2 or 3 years forecasted just below 5% tax increase. And those taxes would include increase in infrastructure funding. So, you know, so it would be with a 2% increase, for instance, as proposed here, it would be similar to that.
Okay, so I guess through you, Chair. So that's not 2.06% on top of the 5% that we had in our 5-year financial plan.
Mr. Payne?
Through Your Worship, no, it's not on top of that. There would be some taken off because we did include infrastructure funding increases in that plan already.
Thank you very much. For my clarification, Mr. Payne, just so we're all in the same book, we're talking about a 2% or 2.06% increase. That is the increase of overall taxes, not an increase of the infrastructure spending. Is that correct?
Absolutely, yes, sir.
Just want to make sure we're all clear on what that is. Okay.
And Your Worship, if you don't mind, I'd like to answer Councillor Braithwaite's question more specifically. I'm just scrolling through the financial plan. I'll be able to get to it quite quickly because then council and the public can know apples for apples or how much of an increase does this compare to what was already proposed. So for instance, here we are. So for instance, in 2022, in our 5-year financial plan, 2021 through 2025, we were proposing a 3% infrastructure increase. So this, if we did a 2.06% over 6 years, it would actually reduce what we said our 2022 tax increase would be. And then in 2023, it was 2.4, 2024 was 2.9. So we have significant increases already built into the 5-year plan for infrastructure. And this would just simply replace that. It wouldn't add to it.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Payne. Go ahead, Councillor Patterson.
Yes, thank you, Mayor, and through you.
I'm just logging in.
Wasn't me. And through you two staff, for water utility rates and sewer utility rates, then I am believing this would then be through usage. Is that correct?
Thank you, Councillor Patterson. Mr. Payne, perhaps you can just give a quick review of what percentage is usage versus fixed.
I believe, Your Worship, that 35% of our water revenue is fixed and the remaining is consumption. And for sewer, we have 30% funded by taxation and 70% funded by consumption.
Thank you. So in this plan then, if a home is used as a vacation home or it is not occupied through the year in entirety, the consumption in those homes would probably be reduced over other homes. So in essence then, the homeowners who are not occupying their home for the full year would not be paying the same total amount that the full-time occupants would be paying.
That is correct. Yeah, and I think I just want to separate the discussion around the allocation of those funds from this discussion, which is the asset management discussion today, just in the interest of time. But yes, it's a fair point, and I think it's something we have to come back to. Go ahead, Mr. Payne.
Yep, thank you, Your Worship. Okay, on to the next slide. I just wanted to demonstrate the impact of council decision, the short-term council decision-making has made in the long term. So this graph sort of depicts the trend of our reserves over the next 100 years, how we had to replace our infrastructure at current funding levels. And you see there's a clear downward trend in how much debt we would need over the 100 years had we continued with 2017 funding. Since 2017, as I mentioned, Council has increased funding from $3.7 million annually to $8.2 million. And that's the difference it made in that trend over that 100 years. So that's a total of a $445 million funding gap that Council has essentially solved in the last less than 5 years, in this Council term, 3 years. And so sustainable funding would result in this trend line here. You notice in the 2027 area or so, we still would go negative in our reserves. That just means that we would need some debt. So even with sustainable funding, if it were implemented right now, we would still need some debt. But you can see a clear difference in the trend line for sustainable funding in our reserves over the 100-year period. And so the difference between what we estimate to be sustainable funding and current funding is another $460 million. So you could say that Council has made almost half progress in solving the annual funding gap just in the last 3 years. So I just wanted to demonstrate that because it can seem sometimes that Council's just making a decision that impacts the next year's budget, and frankly, the district has evolved past just a next year budget sort of lens with its budgeting, and certainly over the 100 years, Council governance decision making has a huge impact on the next generation. So some of the key recommendations that come out of this report, continuing with them, is replace the $274 million overdue assets over the next 25 years. We figure that the 25-year time frame is the appropriate amount of time frame. It's not such that it increases the district's risk with respect to those useful lives past an unreasonable pace, but it's also recognizing the huge challenge it will be to replace $274 million over that period. It's not something that can be done in much shorter of a period. And there's also a number of assets that will come due in that 25 years as well that we will have to replace, not just the $274 million. So we want to significantly increase the replacement of road, water, storm, and sanitary sewer infrastructure. If we're able to do that, then there will be a clear trend in our forecasted cumulative infrastructure gap. And you see how Council quick action in this Council term really impacts that trend line. You know, it's a slow, gradual rise over the last century, but it's something that would need to be solved rather quickly over the next 70 or so years. So just to summarize, I think the success in respect of the priorities that Council has set. Council has reduced the 100-year funding gap by $460 million since 2018, and the pace of annual increase in infrastructure funding, I would assert that is unprecedented. Certainly in my experience, it's unprecedented. Don't forget that we've prepared this Asset Management BC endorsed long-term financial sustainability plan, and we did it rather quickly. Council, in my mind, rightly prioritized this to be done quickly, and we were able to mobilize and do that. And we received the first endorsement by Asset Management BC in that program's history for this plan. And such a long-term plan, it's very uncommon in BC local governments. I would say there are some major municipalities who are quite mature in their asset management, who have been in existence for a long time, who have invested in such a plan. But there's a lot of local governments that is accumulating an infrastructure funding gap and not really reporting out. So I think it takes a bit of bravery to ask for this information, and it's in the spirit of transparency. Your Worship, the last slide that I have after this is to go over a bit of a sensitivity analysis. Essentially, the sensitivity analysis was done just to see what would happen to our forecast if we changed any of the very important variables. And ultimately what happens is The conclusions of this report don't change. The broad conclusions of this report don't change even if we change some of those variables. I won't go over those variables at this time unless council wishes to discuss that further, just so you know that information has been prepared. And that will conclude the presentation at the time, and we're available for questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have a couple of hands popping up here, so go ahead, Councillor Braithwaite, then Patterson.
Thanks so much, and through you, Mayor. Okay, so I have two questions, I think, Mr. Payne. How do you know how we're doing in relation or comparison to other municipalities in this regard as far as our asset management goes?
Please answer that question without throwing anybody under the bus, Mr. Payne.
Your Worship. I'll answer broadly. And Your Worship, sorry, before I answer that question, I should mention that there actually is a next step slide that I need to go over. So if you don't mind, I'll answer the question for Councillor Braithwaite. And I forgot to get to the next step slides, which is important in the governance decision making. So I apologize for that.
Nope, go ahead.
I'd answer broadly, Councillor Braithwaite, and to say it would be no surprise that communities that are growing, that are earning new tax revenue with new buildings every year, who have young infrastructure, who do not feel the pressure of replacing that infrastructure, are most commonly not sustainably funding their infrastructure. For long-established municipalities who are built out, who have mature infrastructure, they have no choice but confront this, and so they're confronting it much like we are. So, Your Worship, if you don't mind, can I go over next steps now?
Yeah, please do, Mr. Payne.
Right, thank you. Sorry about that, Your Worship. Next steps would be to inform and consult with the public. We're recommending in the report that Council direct us to include questions about this plan and asset management in general in the budget questionnaire, which would be going out in very short order here in October. And that consultation, we would put together the feedback that we received from that to help Council inform the 2022 and 2026 financial plan. In addition to that, we're recommending that Council direct us to return in Q1 of 2022 with recommendations on infrastructure project delivery. So how quickly can we scale up our infrastructure output? How quickly can we prepare those capital programs? How quickly can we combine the various capital asset master plans and have one coherent capital plan that takes priority into consideration? So we're recommending that you ask us to return in Q1 with that information. So here are the recommended motions from staff on your screen. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Payne. I'll go back to Councillor Braithwaite at this point.
Thanks so much. Number one, I'm very proud of what we as a council have done over the past 3 years. I'm sad that the councils before this did not have the good guidance or the foresight to perhaps save a little bit more than what we did. However, we're going in the right direction, so I'm very proud of that. And thank you so much for this report. This document, the Sustainable Infrastructure Replacement Plan document, is such an easy read, and I think that people will, if people do take the time to go through it, that'll give them a really good understanding of exactly where we are as a municipality, and I think that's really important. So thank you to staff for that. My question would be, is there any reason not to borrow or take on debt to complete some of this infrastructure replacement now, especially for the assets that are most in jeopardy, for example, the drainage or the roads? What would the cost be to us to do something like that? Or would there be a risk to us to do something like that?
Thank you, Councillor Braithwaite. Mr. Payne?
Thank you, Your Worship. So if I understand the question correctly, please correct me if I'm wrong. The question being, is there any disadvantage to us taking on debt now so that we could replace infrastructure quicker? That's critical and at the end of its life. Is that a fair characterization of the question?
I think you said it much better than I did. So thank you.
The answer would be yes. The financial or the Sustainable Infrastructure Replacement Plan essentially is recommending that. we have reserves now and we have annual funding. So every year we're putting $8.2 million in the reserves, and we're taking out more than that at the current pace of our financial plan. So at some point in the near future, we will have used all of our infrastructure replacement reserves, and at that time we'll have to say, council, it's time to take on debt. And we can't accomplish what this plan proposes in the next 25 years without doing that. So really, first step is us to come back to you and say, this is how quickly we can increase capital output if you're agreeable to that pace. And then I'll tell you when I expect we will need to take on debt and how much. It's sort of an inevitability in this plan if we want to replace infrastructure at the pace that it recommends.
Thank you, Mr. Payne. Go ahead, Councillor Braithwaite.
Thank you. Yes, thank you, Mr. Payne. And my last question would be, when you talk about the next steps, etc., and you talk about the project delivery capabilities and things like that, and it makes me think of having a project in a box kind of a thing, so that when grant opportunities come up, that we could hopefully apply for some grants in and around infrastructure funding. And I guess my question is has there been in the past a lot of available grants that we could perhaps help us in the future?
Go ahead, Mr. Payne.
Your Worship, I would say historically there aren't a lot of grants that pay for replacement of existing assets. The senior levels of government generally expect local governments to pay for the replacement of the assets that it currently owns. And that's because we have broad taxation abilities, and we also have a pretty significant ability to take on debt. That being said, there are exceptions, and we want to be ready to take advantage of those exceptions. And certainly building confidence into the long-term financial plan will ensure that when we spend money preparing a shelf-ready project, we're not wasting that money. Council is committed to actually spending that money on capital. So we've got shelf-ready projects, we can take advantage of that. So, it's a governance signal that is picked up on by senior levels of government. And furthermore, senior levels of government, they want to see that you have asset management plans in place. They don't want to necessarily be on the hook for replacing your rec center again after 50 years. They want to see that you've implemented sustainable funding. So having a plan like this and direction from council to fund in a certain way makes your grant applications more successful. The last comment I would make though is, we look forward to taking advantage of those grant opportunities. But again, when you look at the scope of how much we expect to spend over the next 100 years, being $1.3 billion, there's not, even if we won $20 million, $30 million worth of grants, it's not going to take much of a dent of what we need to do.
Thank you. And just one comment. I mean, I know that I saw a statistic where across Canada there's such an aging infrastructure that perhaps it might be that the government is going to have to step in at certain areas to provide funding for the amount of municipalities that are in the same position as we are. So it'll be very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Braithwaite. I have in the speaking order Councillor Patterson, then Nathan Green.
Yes, thank you, Mayor, and through you to staff. This builds on some of the questioning that Councillor Braithwaite put forward, but every dollar that's placed into a reserve is a dollar that's not being spent on infrastructure or service delivery in the year it was collected, so that it's put aside for the big ticket items. So how do we respond to those who will ask if we aren't sacrificing short-term service delivery to in fact do reserves? Because Mr. Payne talked about 25 years. Well, I think there are quite a few members of this community that are saying, I don't want to wait 25 years. I want the tax dollars I'm paying today to, particularly when we have such a significant backlog. So how do we respond to that question about, are we sacrificing doing repairs today by not using debt and instead putting the money into reserve funds?
Thank you, Councillor Patterson. Go ahead, Mr. Payne.
Your Worship, an excellent question, and what I would say, there's two sides of the equation, as we all know. The funding side, so taking the money and having it available to spend on capital, and then of course actually spending on capital. You can see in our financial plans that we've really escalated capital spending at a fast pace, but that pace is dwarfed by what we're recommending in the Sustainable Infrastructure Replacement Plan. And what the Infrastructure Replacement Plan recommends is a scaling up of 3 to 5 times current capital spending on water, sewer, roads, storm drain. So how do we get there? We don't want just the money sitting in reserves. It's there for capital replacement, and now's the time for capital replacement. It's going to take a tremendous effort, and I'll invite the Director of Engineering and Public Works. It's going to take a tremendous effort to scale up at the pace that is necessary under this plan, and that's primarily why we've asked for council direction here in the second bullet.
Thank you, Mr. Payne. And would like an answer from Mr. Horan as well, Councillor Patterson?
Capital programming. I will say it's all coming together. I know for someone who's had their basement flooded, pothole or what have you, it's difficult to ask for patience. But it is all together. When you look at all the master plans that are underway and will be complete by the end of 2023, the majority of our asset classes and its value will have master plans. So that gives us the capability of consolidated capital programming.
We are experiencing internet connection issues.
Yeah, we are here experiencing that. So if we can just, but we're not done. We're just, for whatever reason, the connectivity here is kicked off. I just see the little frantically blinking light on the Wi-Fi here. It might just be a little.
Just kicked us all out of Zoom.
Thank you, everyone. We are
recording in progress.
Mayor Murdoch, make sure the meeting's going okay.
Yep. So if
just for anyone who can hear me, we are experiencing internet connection issues, so a few minutes of patience might be required here.
I believe we are actually back online now. Can Mr. Payne, can you hear me okay? Oh, I've got internet connection here. I'm seeing the Zoom here. Hold on.
It's Mayor Murdoch through Zoom.
So I'm going to go back to Mr. Horan, who I see online here. Mr. Horan, are you able to hear me? I'm showing as your microphone is working right now, Ms. Williams, so I'm not sure what's happening here on the online stream.
It's showing as not working?
You're highlighted. Oh, there's...
Recording in progress.
It's connecting and losing.
Oh, yours is having a problem. Mine is now reconnected solidly, so we'll just give it a second here.
Your Worship, if you can hear me, you're still very broken up, and it's like an electronic distortion of your voice, so it might just have to catch up for a moment.
Thank you, Ms. Varela. We'll give it a moment to catch up. Absolutely. If you can hear me, I'm just going to turn on. I can't really turn off my electronic devices. That might help, but I can't do it since I need access to communications. We are definitely
recording in progress.
Okay, so we seem to be getting some of our connectivity back here again. My apologies for those watching or on Zoom if you can't.
Still unstable.
We are definitely very unstable here in our internet connection in our space, so I'm not sure what's causing that, but we're just going to wait to see if it can resolve. So I think our stream is going out barely, but I think we're not, we're still having a real issue with our staff access.
Yeah, I keep losing the Zoom instance and going back in. It keeps reconnecting.
And again, if anybody's at home and listening to us, if you can hear our stream, just be a heads up that we are still struggling for it's a very strange problem, but we're trying to get the Zoom connection in the room back online. And I think we're getting there now. We're starting to see the Zoom back up, the instance back up. And so I'm going to turn back at this point. Is your microphone on and Ms. Williams? Okay, and so I might just turn to back to Mr. Payne if he can hear me. I don't actually see Mr. Payne. Oh, I do. Is Mr. Payne able to hear me in this conversation at this point? Okay. Yeah, so Ms. Williams, you're going to have to turn your microphone on, and then we'll have full access. Perfect. So, back to the question that was here. We were just going to ask Mr. Haran if he had the ability to talk to the capacity as much as he can. I understand this is the intention here is to come back in Q1 with a more detailed options for scaling up the actual work. But perhaps Mr. Haran, you can talk to some of the possibilities and challenges of scaling up to the kind of size of capital work that we're contemplating here.
Yes, absolutely, Your Worship. I think one of the things that we need to think about and factor in as we have this discussion tonight is in the agenda package, there's some links for reference to the discussion we had in January, which was the June, where we talked about the asset management program and the capital program that goes along with it. And there's a lot of information in there that we didn't cover the ground again tonight, but just in terms of, as a reminder, what we talked about there was the specific levels of capital output that the district has done. And when I say capital output, I use that as the short term, but what I mean is the amount of infrastructure work we're doing. So water main replacements and sanitary sewer and storm and roads and how things have been going since 2015 from the beginning of the asset management program. And what we showed in June in terms of the various information there was that since Council's decision to increase infrastructure funding and increase the output of actual maintenance that we're doing and replacements that we're doing, we've significantly increased how much we're doing within the district, which we're very proud of. And the thing, though, that we were trying to point out, though, is that even though we had done a lot more than had been done historically, we were still only able to replace, for example, in sanitary sewer and storm sewers, 1% of the system per year in the last few years, which is less than what needs to happen in order to catch up to this historical deferred maintenance and to address the infrastructure that's coming due for replacement in a few years. So that's one piece of information. And there's a number of other pieces of information that we can use to try to kind of how to wrap our heads around how much work is to be done beyond just the funding. So the funding is the first step, but then there's the actual project delivery, the actual replacements and so on. So we've made a best we can do at this time estimate of 3 to 5 times the amount of work that we're currently planning to do, starting as soon as possible. So this recommendation here in the terms of the governance decision at hand is more so not about whether there's a lot more work to be done in terms of capital delivery. It's more about how do we intend to do that. So what needs to happen within the district in terms of growing our capabilities, growing our ability to do this work, and what are the impacts of those things, and then what are the expectations that the community should have around our ability to grow this this capability. So taking capital output and increasing it by 3 to 5 times, say, even if it's just 3 times, even if it's just doubling, is a significant change in terms of what it takes to plan for and then deliver that kind of construction and maintenance activity. And when Mr. Payne was talking earlier about how there are very few municipalities that have done of this size and these amount of resources like Oak Bay that have done asset management plans, financial plans like this, it's also true that there are very few municipalities of this size and capability that have been able to quickly grow in terms of the ability to deliver on this kind of maintenance. Short-term growth, yes, but in terms of sustained 10, 15, 20-year growth. So that's the intention of this report, is to talk more about that, talk more about levels of service and what the expectations should be. But absolutely, one of the key takeaways needs to be that funding is part one of this, and that's a very difficult decision from the governance perspective to make and for the community to make, but that it has to follow along, that it's not just putting money aside. We actually have to start being able to ramp up how much we plan and deliver maintenance rehabilitation in the district. And based on every piece of information that we have and that we've presented to the community and to council, we need to do that. We need to start accelerating that output immediately.
Thank you, Mr. Horan. Do you have a follow-up, Councillor Patterson?
I do. Thank you, Mayor, and through you to perhaps Mr. Payne for this one. But is it reasonable to use debt to create intergenerational equity for well-built infrastructure that delivers sustained economic or social benefits to future generations, like using some debt to build in some of the things that this council and even previous councils have approved, and ensure that we're not just replacing what we have in existence, but we're actually building on our visions of complete streets, age-friendly communities, climate emergency. How do we ensure that we have those discussions in what we're considering for asset replacement?
Thank you, Councillor Patterson. I'll turn that over to, I'm not sure, probably Mr. Horan is the more appropriate person of the two. Or perhaps if it's the question is more about the, you're asking an ethical question about the use of debt. I'll give that to Mr. Payne, and if Mr. Horan wants to jump in, I'll do that. Go ahead, Mr. Payne.
Your Worship, I would say my answer being based completely on what other local governments have done, it's not out of the ordinary whatsoever. In fact, a lot of this infrastructure, which by today's standards is just old infrastructure, was created using debt, right? So it was originally built using debt, and now we have a better idea of what a complete street looks like. Would it be inappropriate for council to use debt to do that as well? No, not in my opinion, based on what other local governments do often. And in fact, that's a primary function of governance, is really balancing priorities. So how do you balance the needs to replace and the cost pressures of replacing your existing infrastructure with improving your community in other ways? That's a difficult part of the job.
Thank you, Mr. Payne. I think in fairness, that question comes back to council and ultimately where we want to assign the costs. But Mr. Horan, you wanted to just touch on that as well?
Yes, thank you, Your Worship. I think to add to that discussion, just that answer to that question is there's definitely aspects of the asset management program, which are not yet complete, which is work that still has to be done. And one of the big ones that has to be done still, that helps us answer this question is the discussion around levels of service. And we have de facto levels of service for all those infrastructure areas, so water, sewer, stormwater, but we're not far enough along in the asset management journey where those things have been necessarily written down, at least not extensively, and not community consulted, and then not approved by council. So that's one of the next projects in the list, which is meant to be brought up and discussed at the council's strategic priority sessions here later in the fall. And some of those start to speak to the ideas of if you have a lower level of service for roads, for example, it wouldn't be appropriate to have really extensive complete streets networking, active transportation, and so on. Whereas if you have a higher level of service, you can. And so those where there needs to be, as part of the governance decision-making process in the district, a way to consider those ideas about, well, what is the expectation for what a service looks like, and then what are the associated costs and risks and how to deliver on those. So that's something that in a smaller municipality like Oak Bay, we'd love to have all these things done all at once. In fact, it would have been outstanding if we could put together a report like tonight's Sustainable Infrastructure Replacement Plan 5 years ago, except there's so much work that had to happen before tonight could even come close to being occurring. And it's the same thing. It doesn't make sense to do this extensive level of service discussion before you have a good long-term financial plan, at least a first draft in place. So that's the first thing. The next one is, as you start to look at specific things like master planning activities, those are where you start to really narrow down what is it that you're actually going to build or replace with. And that's where the like-for-like discussions come in. So when it comes to things like the storm sewer system, for example, that's the process where you start to assess, both from a technical and a community service perspective, is the system as it's built now meeting the district's needs, meeting the community's needs, and if not, what changes need to happen in order to address those levels of service. So again, significant amount of work that goes into defining those in more detail, but none of that can happen. All of that is just aspirational if there's no foundational projects completed, and long-term sustainable funding is one of those things that signals that there is going to be a long-term plan to replace infrastructure. It signals that the difficult growth of capability and ability to deliver on these aspirations is able to begin. So all of it kind of feeds together into this long multi-year plan, but we can't do it all at once, especially not in a smaller municipality.
Thank you, Mr. Haran, and I appreciate the fulsomeness of that answer. I'm cognizant of time and the fact that we have a large number of councillors who still have yet to even ask a question. So I'm going to try and get through some of these questions a bit more expediently, and I'm going to try and go to the public around 9:30 so that they have a chance to ask questions or make comments as well. So go back to you, Councillor Patterson.
Thank you, and I do appreciate Mr. Haran's answer, and I just really want to say I am very grateful. I've waited for many years and been talking about asset management in the district, so I am ever so grateful that this report has finally made it to council and to the public. One thing I'd like to comment on, that at UBCM's conference that was just held recently, there was a workshop on financial resiliency, today's recovery, tomorrow's new economy. I don't know how many attended, and I must apologize to our staff. I took lots of notes, but I didn't get them transcribed, and luckily there is a report out now, and I have downloaded a copy, but I didn't have the opportunity to send it to staff. But there was a lot of discussion on local and global impacts on our communities, and how those will inform our finances as local districts going forward. And some of the things they talked about were high housing prices and the resulting high mortgage costs that will constrain residential property taxes, revenues from gasoline taxes and how they will fall over time with electrification of vehicles, requiring a rethink of actually the gas tax funding and how we will make up those funds. interjurisdictional competitiveness and how other levels of governance will be focused on some of the outcomes of post-COVID debt and the demands to address seniors' care, child care, and health care, and so that there would be a diminished capacity to share revenues with us, and it's sort of an expectation that it might affect the grant money available. And for local governments, the status quo policy most likely will mean substantial and increasing pressure on residential property taxes for rising costs of downloaded service requirements in emergency management, protective services, cybercrime, and climate change. So, I mean, the presentation tonight has been wonderful, but it does show that certainly there's a lot of discussion that will need to come back to the council table, and other factors that are over and above asset management that will be impacting on our budgets. So there's still a lot of discussion to go forward. And I will, in fact, forward that report over to Mr. Payne so that he has it, because I think it's useful information for future reports. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Patterson. Again, probably highlights the need for us to be responsible in our making sure that we're fully funding our assets. I have Councillor Ney, then Green, then Appleton, then I'll assume Councillor Zelk would like to speak as well if he has any questions. Go ahead, Councillor Ney.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. Mr. Payne, could you go back to the slide? It's entitled Annual Funding History. It's the one with the 5 bars that show the increase in funding since 2017. It's about 5 back from, there we go. Yeah, there we go. Thank you very much, Mr. Payne, for this remarkable piece of work, and the amount of work and time that and smarts you put into this is very profitable for all of us. And Mr. Horan, thank you very much also for helping us to understand the reality, of the progression of how we get here and the reality going forward of what we can expect. It's really useful to hear that the journey that we're on and that we've come from. I have 2 points I want to make, and I asked for this slide to come up because especially after you spoke, Mr. Horan, to help us understand this process that we're undergoing right now around managing our assets. This diagram shows that funding it starts at 2017, but in the context of the comments you've made, Mr. Horan, my understanding is, and this is certainly my experience having served on 2 previous terms here, is that this process didn't commence at the beginning of this term when we started to put money in 2019. Fundings started, 2017, but even before that. And for us to be able to put the amount of money we did in 2017, the councils before us commissioned reports. A very notable report, of course, is the Opus report, which was, I think we budgeted at 2014, and it came out in 2016, which set us up to do this funding in 2017. And I only bring that up because the comment Councillor Braithwaite made could be misinterpreted that it's just this council that's taken this seriously, but I know for sure the council before this and the one before that was on a track to get us here. And I really appreciate the seriousness that this council has taken into it, but I think we needn't do that at the expense of, the work and the foresight that at least 2 councils before this also had to get us to this place. So that's a bit political, but I just think it's worth stating, and that we don't overgloat ourselves here, at least the elected officials. I don't think that's so for the staff, that it is just us doing this. We're working on the backs of the work that other councils have done and staff have done before us. So that's just a comment, Mr. Mayor. The second point, if you could go to the second last slide, please. The one where you're about the consultation. And I guess my question to staff through you, Mayor, is to inform and consult with public using a questionnaire. And I wonder, I don't know if this is fixed, a budget questionnaire is the basis of the inform and consult, but it seems to me, and I know we are in a pandemic, endemic, whatever, but this is quite complex, and I know when I talk to people who are interested in this, there's a lot of discussion, and I'm wondering if staff is considering above and beyond a questionnaire, the possibility of some pocket forums or some face-to-face type things, and I appreciate we're in odd times and there are constraints there, but I would be interested in staff commenting on the value that may exist around face-to-face as opposed to paper questionnaires, and maybe the pros and cons, if you could speak to that.
I'll just give it to staff in terms of that. In terms of alternate ways of providing input, and I will just point out on this that ultimately this is going to come to budget, and where we do have a fair bit of public input as well. But I'll give that to Mr. Payne. I suppose if there's any contemplation of any other avenues for public consultation.
Thank you, Your Worship, through Councillor Ney. What I would say is that, we'll put some serious consideration in how to communicate this information, however that looks. And don't forget, we've been very deliberate in identifying this as the district's draft Sustainable Infrastructure Replacement Plan, because it is a living document. So it needs to be discussed and changed and consulted with the community in many different ways. We do have some plans in the near future here, in addition to the budget questionnaire, to reach a greater audience, including a short video, 3 minutes, explaining the plan and how folks can comment on it in the budget questionnaire. And we expect that'll generate some interest in the community. So, we certainly wouldn't want to limit our options in terms of how we engage the community. I think it's fair to say there's a pent-up demand in the community to return to in-person services, whether that be at council or just at a front counter. And there's a value in that. I could not agree more with that.
Good. Thank you. That's all, Mr. Mayor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Ney. And I appreciate your earlier comment on this. I think it is worthwhile noting. You're absolutely correct that this process of asset management work and planning started some time ago, and we couldn't be where we are right now without that. I don't also want to undersell the courage that this council did take and takes in terms of moving things forward in the financial. We took a leap of faith. We knew there was a big gap, and there's been substantial tax increases that we're being held accountable for ultimately as council, knowing that we had this gap to do. And I think it's worth noting that there's that's not easy to do, and the fact that so few jurisdictions have put the money in and increased the investment is I want to thank council for doing that. And it wasn't just this, but it was the whole change of process to 5-year financial planning and putting in asset management funding at the beginning of the council terms to add funding to our strategic planning, so we weren't sort of leaving things dangling without funding at the end of it all. So I think this as a whole, the financial planning under this council has been quite, it's allowed us to be here to have these kind of depth of conversation. So absolutely right. There's been lots of work before this, but I also want to thank this council for the courage they've taken to this point to get us to where we are. So it's only halfway apparently, but at least it's part way. Go ahead, Councillor Green, and then Appleton, and then Zelka.
Thank you, Mayor. And yes, thanks to Mr. Horan, to Mr. Payne, and to all the staff that were involved in compiling this report. And it is one of the single most important areas that we hear about often from the public. And I do want to reinforce the fact that anything that you can do in terms of public input is really worthwhile. I think, we have come through a really difficult time, and I know I really missed the contact with public and that ability to talk to them and hear their ideas and issues and so on. So I'm pleased about the questionnaire. And my only question about the questionnaire, just wondering if you could give us any idea about how you will use the public feedback from the questionnaire to inform planning and implementation going forward. Sometimes people are cynical about questionnaires. They fill them in, but they don't sometimes believe that they make a huge impact. But I do believe in this case that you will be, and I'm also impressed with the collaboration between engineering and finance. I think that's critical. But I just wondered if you could just briefly describe how you might be using the input that you receive. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Green. Mr. Payne, how does that feedback to us as council?
Your Worship, well, the results of the budget questionnaire are compiled by Director of Strategic Initiatives and packaged together for council to see. Not only does council get to see the results of the aggregate results of the questionnaire, but also the individual comments and responses. So I would say that there is an opportunity if a member of the public fills the budget questionnaire out. There is quite an opportunity to reach the audience, which would be their council. So the information gets packaged. Last year, staff analyzed the results and integrated some of those results into the budget plan. For instance, when we went over the capital budget, we mentioned what the budget questionnaire said about those capital budgets and general comments about support for this service or not for service. So those sort of consolidated conclusions are presented to council along with the budget questionnaire results. So I imagine that would be our process this year as well. This coming year.
Thank you, Mr. Payne. Go ahead, Councillor Green.
Yes, and thank you very much, Mr. Payne, for that answer. I appreciate it. Just one last point for the benefit of my colleagues and staff. I am really encouraged by the collaboration that I'm seeing in the integration between departments on some of this kind of work. Unfortunately, governments tend to, when they develop departmental organizations, they also tend to silo. Not only do they silo the work, they silo each other, the employees. So what I'm encouraged by is a culture that seems to be developing here in Oak Bay that is trying to break down some of those barriers. And so thank you very much for that.
Thank you, Councillor Green. I witness the same thing here all the time, and I'm very pleased with it. So thank you for staff. And I have next Councillor Appleton.
Thank you very much, Your Worship. And I, like my colleagues, can sense the palpable, despite the numbers involved in the report, I can sense the palpable excitement with the delivery of this report. So I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge, what it represents and where we've arrived at, and it allows council to really clearly communicate with the community about what it is that we're hoping to accomplish with this infrastructure journey. So there's few things that are as important as this. So I thank you very much. I will ask a question of Mr. Payne, which I actually kind of know the answer to, but I think it behooves us to communicate really clearly to the public, in the sense that the plan projects that the district will have to take on debt in the 25-year time frame, as he stated, to be able to accomplish the goals of the plan. That debt is necessary. Also stated in the plan fairly clearly is that revenue, that the accomplishment of the plan is based on essentially revenue staying more or less as it is now, as a built-out community and being largely dependent on residential property taxes. So I was just wondering whether Mr. Payne might want to comment on that. There is another factor at work here, and that is the provision of additional revenue. So we can assume that the tax base will stay constant, or we can also look to a future where the tax base is expanded, and that may potentially lessen our need to borrow. And I was just wondering whether Mr. Payne could comment on that.
Sure. Thank you, Councillor Appleton. Go ahead, Mr. Payne.
Yes, Your Worship. There are a couple other, let's call the revenue sources or revenue balances that can assist in funding the plan. We have taken a simplistic approach to this, as Councillor Appleton has pointed out, and just assumed the proportion of taxes that we currently utilize would continue in terms of user fees and what have you. But there are other opportunities, for instance, Parks, Rec and Culture and the user fees that we collect from over there. They pay a portion through those user fees of the replacement of assets. And so if we saw revenue growth in that area, we could see funding for infrastructure grow as well. There's other user fees as well that could help fund along the way. As we discussed earlier, there's possibilities for capital grants. I sort of mentioned that capital grants for the replacement of existing capital isn't common, but we have a recent example where our chiller, over $500,000, we received a grant for that at the Parks, Rec and Culture Department that would otherwise have been funded by reserve. So there is an example of how grants reduce the burden to the community. And then there's also ways to diversify our tax base depending on, of course, council governance in terms of expanding business or industrial tax rates. Those are all possibilities that are dependent on council direction moving forward.
Thank you, Mr. Payne. Go ahead, Councillor Appleton.
Thank you, Your Worship, and I appreciate those comments, because I would just like members of the public, as they review the plan, to reflect and just be aware of the fact that there is that other influencing factor of revenue, and that revenue is not necessarily constant for the district over time, and that there are some of the other decisions that this council will be evaluating have an effect on overall revenue for the community and the ability to attenuate and address what's laid out in the plan. Just one other question, Your Worship. With respect to climate change, I'm definitely of the view that the plan, as Mr. Payne has stated, this is a living plan. I expect it to need to adapt quite significantly to climate change impacts over time. As laid out and understood at this juncture, that staff will not have the information to be able to make those kinds of projections, and that's understood. It does identify in the plan that staff identify that further work resources, etc., are required to get definition around climate change impacts and get that. I feel that that's something that's needed immediately and should be prepared in short order, such that as we move forward with the plan, that it can be informed by as good as information as we can gather about climate change modeling and climate change impacts. I guess my question to staff is, it does call for additional resources and additional staff time to accomplish that analysis. What do we need to do, or what direction does council need to provide in order for staff to prepare that analysis, and what would we be looking at for timeline?
Thank you, Councillor Appleton. I'll go to Mr. Payne on that, but he may want to defer this to Mr. Horan.
Thank you, Your Worship, and I probably will put my CAO on the spot if you don't mind, and if that's appropriate. I would hazard a guess that that would be something appropriately addressed through Council's strategic priorities process, which I believe is scheduled for November this year. So every year, Council has an opportunity to review its strategic priorities and reprioritize and resource those priorities. I think this request would be significant enough where that would be appropriate, and so if you wouldn't mind, I would recommend that Ms. Varela answer anything further about that.
Thank you, Mr. Payne. Ms. Varela, anything else to add to that?
No, Your Worship, I would merely reiterate what Director Payne has already provided. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. May just get a little bit of clarification for Mr. Horan, if you don't mind. And that is, in my reading of the report, I had the sense that that functionality, the impacts on things like storm drains, were sort of estimated in here, and were sort of in the plan. So is there a timeline for those sort of in mind at this point, or is that sort of entirely net new, or just to be moved up in the timeline? I guess would be my question.
Yes, thank you, Worship. There's two parts to answer the question. I hope it addresses the full concerns. The first one, as my colleagues mentioned, a few months ago, we brought forward a report related to the Belka Creek watershed and the plans related to daylighting and so on, and just made the observation that that when we consider natural assets and the watershed and stormwater management as a whole, that the staff complement that we currently have historically and leading up to now is not set up to address stormwater management in a progressive way. So we made recommendations, and council passed the resolution to direct us to come back to discuss that kind of resourcing from an operational perspective at strategic priorities later in the fall. So that's part of the plan. That's the first part of the answer. The second part of the answer is from a bigger picture perspective. In the asset management program, the stormwater master plan, which is meant to begin in 2022 and is likely to be delivered in 2023 and perhaps 2024, because it's a significant project, is the key activity that will factor in everything that we can find, that we can determine with respect to climate change. So for example, the idea of climate modeling is fundamental to a long-term stormwater master plan. The idea of a model of our system in terms of what pipes we have and how big they are and how much water they can handle is just fundamentally part of the idea of there are certain pipes that are the right size now and can just be replaced when they reach the end of their service lives. But there will be others and more significant technical challenges to address when we factor in more intense and longer and more frequent storms as expected. So the second part of the question is how do we deal with climate change is fundamentally in the stormwater master planning process.
Great, that's helpful. Thank you, Mr. Horan. Anything else, Councillor Appleton?
Just really quickly, Your Worship, as a follow-up, and I appreciate Director Horan's comments, maybe just as a follow-up to that, and not to get too far off the asset management topic, but I guess following up on his comments, are we as a district at a juncture now that if we want to comprehensively evaluate climate change impacts to the district, evaluate the various interfaces that's going to have on district operations, that we're going to potentially need some additional capacity, some specialized capacity on the staff team to accomplish that? Not that that doesn't mean that folks on the staff team can't already do that, but I know that they have other work to do. So I'm just wondering whether that's something that we should be casting our minds to as far as staff capacity, specifically on climate change adaptation.
Thank you, Councillor Appleton. I think I'll let staff answer if they wish, but I think that's probably exactly the kind of questions that will come back. Mr. Horan, do you want to add anything to that at this point?
No, Your Worship, just that's what we mean by it being addressed with the strategic priorities here later in the fall. The idea is assessing a level of service around stormwater management, which includes factoring in climate change impacts and so on to our ability to handle that change. So the report is meant to address what our current capabilities are, and capabilities and capacities are kind of both looking at maybe the capabilities here, but we don't have capacity, and then what are the options to address those capacity issues, and then seek some direction from council. Even sometimes a likely outcome of this discussion later in the fall is that providing a fulsome analysis of capabilities and capacities may even be beyond our ability at this point, not in terms of capability, but certainly for capacity. So we'll be seeking some direction around, is that an area of focus with respect to the other strategic priorities and direction that we've been given.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wren.
Thank you, Your Worship.
I think that's very helpful. And I'm going to go now to Councillor Zelka and then to the public.
Is the sound level okay?
It is. Please continue, Councillor Zelka.
Okay, great. Yes. Thank you very much. A couple of quick questions, and of course, my thanks along with everyone else. This is an excellent report, and thank you for rushing it out in such an amazing shape for a draft report. This does not look like your draft report. First question is on page 14. talks about the various asset management program components. I note the storm master plan is not due till 2022-2023. But what is the foreshore capital plan, which is sort of near the bottom of that page, please?
Mr. Haran?
Yes, Your Worship, I'm just catching up here with page reference. Sorry, Councillor Zelka, page 14 of the Sustainable Infrastructure Plan.
Yeah, it looks a bit like that. Well,
I think you probably answered the question without getting there, Mr. Haran. If you just, the question was just the...
I see it.
Figure 3?
Yes, no, I see it. Thank you. So in the so in this document, it's just repeating what is happening in the asset management program. So in the asset management program, there is a number of asset management plans, so water master plan, sewer, storm, and we identified foreshore capital plan and natural assets master plan. And both of those are placeholders for work that needs to be identified and done. So in terms of foreshore, really what we're looking at there so far initially is there are a number of issues related to the foreshore, specific McNeil Bay erosion. There's some issues with McMicking Point, and then there's the idea that the rest of the foreshore, which may not be problems now, but need to be looked at as assets that are planned for and taken care of in the long run, both in terms of funding, but also in terms of planning and project delivery activity over the long term.
Excellent. So then on page 22, where you make reference to your coastline erosion, and it even mentions McNeil Bay, McMicking Point, that's what that's referring to then. Excellent. So back to page 22 then, on the impacts of climate change on forecasting. This describes the various aspects of, for example, rainfall storm events, coastline erosion, sea level rise. If these are not dealt with, they turn very quickly into what's referred to in the vernacular as an emergency. And then suddenly you're dealing with an emergency response, which sometimes foolishly makes us, it gives us access to other funding to restore, recover, respond to. But what I wanted to ask was, with respect to that, I understand the BC government has recently taken on a full accepting of the Sendai framework, which has to do with mitigating risks to mitigate the impacts of potential disaster risk, for example. Any of these things can turn into a disaster and emergency. And of course, with respect to our emergency, this is all sort of tied in with climate change. So there's a resilience aspect here. Will all of this basically be falling into the sort of area of, how do I say, priorities and planning? Or has any of that been factored into this report with respect to a holistic view to dealing with risk that not only deals with the existing depreciation, but also the potential impacts of what would happen with break fix, break repair, that floods, that causes all these erosions and rises and events, things to occur.
Thank you, Councillor Zelka. I'll go to Mr. Haran on that one.
Yes, thank you, Your Worship. I'll do my best to try to answer this one, and if I head off in a direction that doesn't answer the question, please let me know. I think one of the challenges with dealing with infrastructure in general in Oak Bay is that it is a complex, large, challenging issue. And so what we have to do regularly is just really focus our attention on the issue at hand. So for this Sustainable Infrastructure Replacement Plan, almost an 85-page document that covers a lot of ground, a ton of work that goes into it. It's not meant to answer all questions or all challenges in terms of risk management. So the focus, governance-wise, for this evening and for this report has to do with risks that council owns that has to do with program management and has to do with infrastructure sustainability in the long run. But that doesn't mean that this report covers or helps us mitigate all the risks that occur. So what we're trying to convey with this is that we have identified funding gaps and an infrastructure replacement program that's not sustainable which will directly impact levels of service over the long run. So these are things that we know will happen. Levels of service are likely to be impacted in a negative way if action is not taken, both in terms of funding and in terms of project delivery. On top of that, the questions that Councillor Zabelka is asking is the issues that could occur because of things like identified in these climate change issues that could happen in terms of erosion or rainfall storm events or sea level rise, which I guess we're making the point I'm trying to make is these are things that we need to factor in, but the fundamentals need to be addressed first before we also try to deal with the fact that there are also some emergencies that are out of our control that might happen sooner rather than later. So there are a lot of infrastructure risks that the community is holding at the moment. And the best way forward is to deal with the problems that are identified, which is the sustainable funding as the first step.
Thank you, Mr. Huron. Go ahead, Councillor Zelka.
I think that's enough for now. Later on, I will most likely, in addition to the motions that are put forward, we'll be putting forward a motion to asking staff to come up with some sort of an open house. But we'll get there when we get there. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Zelka. At this point, I'm going to go to the public, speaking of public input, to see if anybody wishes to address council. So if you can call the phone number that's there or raise your hand within the Zoom application. I think it's *9. So I'll just go back to my notes here very quickly. Ms. Williams, perhaps you can just give me back that answer if you have it handy.
Thank you, Your Worship. Yes, if we have anyone online who's on a phone presently, they can use *9 to raise their hand, and when called upon can use *6 to unmute.
Great. So again, that was *9 if people wish to raise their hand to speak, and *6 to unmute if people are here. So if you can just give it a second for people. Perhaps while we're just waiting, if anybody does wish to speak, I have some questions. I'm not going to go into too many of them just because in the interest of time, and they don't affect my support for the report that's here. But can I just get a little sense from Mr. Payne, how much lead time is there between, say, a decision to borrow and go through that process with MFA to get that approval, both with and without electoral requirements? And perhaps you could remind us of the threshold at which point we need electoral approval for borrowing. Ms. Williams, can you turn your microphone on?
My apologies.
Go ahead, Mr. Payne.
My apologies. Sorry, can you hear me all right?
We can, thank you.
Okay, great. The MFA, they put out calls for debt issuance twice a year. So once in fall and once in spring. And so typically we would have to have all our ducks in a row by the time that we go to the MFA for debt. And that would involve having an approved financial plan bylaw in place that allows us to take on debt, and of course the electoral approval if necessary. Oak Bay right now has a very small debt servicing ratio. We're about 2.2% of what we could borrow. So we could borrow 50 times what we have right now. There's also a limit by which we don't need to go for electoral assent. I believe we have about another $12 million in debt that we could take on before we would need to ask for electoral approval. The magnitude of debt that's probably required according to the financial forecast in the plan would require electoral assent at some point. So we would see it coming with the capital programming done and the financial plan preparation.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Payne. I appreciate that clarification. I'm going to go back to the public here. Is there anybody who has raised their hand through *9 or through the Zoom application, Ms. Williams?
No, Your Worship. Nobody through the public. Councillor Ney does have her hand up.
I don't know if that's intentional or not. I'll just give her a chance to do it. Councillor Ney, do you have anything else? No, we're good. Okay. And I think everything else here, I'm very comfortable with the questions that have been asked to kind of move it forward in terms of next steps. So, are there any other second-time speakers that wish to speak to anything here? I might just separate out the suggested motions here. The first one is to receive the plan. Moved and seconded. Thank you. Is there any discussion on that? Not seeing any. All those in favor? Any opposed? None opposed. Thank you. There's a second level option here for including the this piece in part of the budget survey.
So moved.
Moved and seconded. Is there any discussion on this? Go ahead, Councillor Patterson.
Yes, thank you, Mayor. And I do appreciate all the work that's been done, and I appreciate the intent of this. I can't support the recommendation that some of these questions be put in the budget questionnaire, simply because I think that they're not sufficient. There's not sufficient clarity for people to read them, understand them, and actually give a reasonable answer. I do have some difficulty with asking isolated questions on a budget without having an overall framework so that people understand the full picture, because, to make an item comment without knowing what the full impact on the taxes will be is a very difficult thing. But when I look at something like on page 4 where it says, as a ratepayer on the water utility, what do you want? Single rate increase of 20, 2 10%, 4 5%, or 8 2.5%, or keep the rate increases to a minimum required to fulfill the district's legal responsibilities as set out by provincial legislation. How many people in the district are going to understand what the minimum required to fulfill the district's legal responsibilities as set out by the province are? And after looking at the presentation and the amount of accumulated infrastructure deficit we have, it's hard to believe that we would reduce in any way the standard that we're working to. So yeah, I can't support putting these types of questions into a questionnaire and expect that we will get any reasonable response from our residents. I think there would have to be a lot of clarification to reframe the question in a way that we get something meaningful and something that the residents can understand. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Patterson. Are there any other comments? If I might just ask very quickly to Mr. Payne, what, if you know the answer, you touched on a little bit on there being informative video. This is a very complicated topic. Obviously, a lot of months gone into this. We always strike this weird balance of trying to solicit public input, but also trying to inform the public in a way that makes the input meaningful. So can you give us any outline of what was to be included in these questions in terms of information to make them, I guess, more meaningful to the public?
Worship, the video that has been prepared, I would say, is essentially the content is very similar to the executive summary in the report. It's very similar to what's been prepared here in the presentation here. It goes over the key recommendations, the key findings, the rationale behind it, and there's a bit of a strategy behind that. We're hoping that the budget questionnaire would stimulate traffic to the Sustainable Infrastructure Replacement Plan, and vice versa. So it's kind of an opportunity to have folks that are interested in the asset management funding side of things to visit the plan because they weren't aware of it. So the video does that as well. It's meant to provide an overview of the infrastructure plan and also invites people to participate in the budget questionnaire.
Okay, thank you. And is the intention to have the questions as detailed as that later, as like Councillor Patterson, in terms of those pieces where each item is given 5 options with that kind of level of detail, or is it be more simplified, as fast as possible, within 5 years, or stretched out as long as possible? Like how would that is it contemplated to have that wording?
Your Worship, the first draft is the full information. It's attempting to strike a balance between providing options without the implications of that options and being able to describe the implication of those options on a high level without being too detailed. So it's a difficult balance to achieve that we're trying there, but the detail that's before you is how the draft is prepared at the moment.
Okay, thank you very much. I think I get that. I see Mr. Horan's hand is up on this. Mr. Horan, did you want to add something?
Yes, thank you, Your Worship. I also wanted to just add that the design of the questions, the intention is there's a couple of selections in terms of some of the answers and some of the questions specifically that help us put into context the way that the answers would be put together. So, for example, there's introductory questions that have an opportunity for the resident who's completing the questionnaire to weigh in terms of how familiar they are with the infrastructure challenges, with the asset management program, where they can actually say, well, I don't know much about it, or I know there's an issue, but I don't have a lot of information about that information. And then later on, there's options for questions about level of service. Not only where the resident can say, I don't know much about the levels of service, but I think they should be A, B, or C. And none of the questionnaire is not meant to be the sole source of information about what the community is thinking on these issues. It's meant to be one tool that allows council as a governing body to assess the various things that are going on in the community about some of these questions and issues. So it's just a way to gather some information. It's not necessarily the full story, but it gives us some indication about how some residents are thinking on these issues.
Thank you, Mr. Horan. I don't see any other hands up on this item. So the motion as it stands is that the infrastructure levels and the pace of tax utility rate increases be included in that budget survey. I'm just going to add my 2 cents. I think it's worth including. I think the budget survey has very limited we have to definitely interpret the results at all times. There's so many things, everything from animal control to everything and in between. I think we have to use our smarts to assess that response. But it does give an opportunity for people to comment and to provide that. So I'm fairly comfortable to include this in that questionnaire. Not seeing any other hands. I'll call the question. All those in favor? And those opposed? Councillor Patterson opposed. Thank you. That passes. And then the last of the recommended motions here is that staff provide a report with recommendations on infrastructure project delivery capacities. Is there?
So moved.
Moved and seconded. This is in Q1 of next year. Is there any discussion on that? I don't see any. I'll call the question. All those in favor? Any opposed? None opposed. And Councillor Zelka, you indicated that you may want to have a motion arising as well.
Yes, thank you very much. I presume that last motion passed. So I wish to put forward an arising motion. Thank you, yes. And further that staff devise a process to hold an open house related to the Sustainable Infrastructure Replacement Plan, with the information feeding into the 2022-2026 financial plan, as another means of public engagement, is the motion I would put forward.
Thank you, Councillor Zelka. I'm looking in to see if there's a seconder for the motion.
Second for discussion.
Okay, moved and seconded. Councillor Zelka, you still have the floor if you wish to motivate.
Oh, thank you very much. If we can have a provincial election in Oak Bay, and we can have a federal election in Oak Bay, and no one getting sick, I would hope that we could come up with a way to have a face-to-face open house of some sort. Of course, it would have to be set up in a different way while this pandemic is ongoing. But I'm so impressed with the level of vaccinations throughout our district that it doesn't worry me greatly. So I would hope that with the previous recommendations put forward, that this type of an open house, not unlike the open house, by the way, that was held for the combined sewer separation project for those who live in the uplands. That was a fantastic open house that was put together a few years ago, for those who remember. I would love to see something like that, but since this material is quite extensive and will result in rather large tax increases, so I think people would very much appreciate the opportunity to talk infrastructure.
Thank you, Councillor Zelka. I have either the second people who put up their hands a second. Any comments, Councillor Appleton?
Thank you, Worship. I guess I would maybe just frame my support in the idea of I do think that any opportunity to engage with the public is definitely valuable, and this is significant enough to engage with the public. I guess I would phrase the request as a request to staff to evaluate the feasibility of doing it, I guess, with the understanding that if it can be accomplished with, I don't actually know whether or not it can be accomplished within current health restrictions, and wouldn't want to put staff on the hot seat to do something that wasn't possible to do. But the flip side would be it may be good to evaluate what the possibility is of hosting such a session with the current restrictions on, and whether or not it's even possible. So.
Thank you, Councillor Appleton. I might go to Ms. Varela on this one, and I guess I would note, I understand the intent of this, that given that the proposed dollar amounts are very, very much in line with our current 5-year financial plan in terms of the increases, if we were seeking to have a more fulsome, thorough discussion with the community, it may not have to be done before this year's budgeting process either. We could actually consider this as just part of as things lift and become more open, we might want to have the time and energy to do it more thoroughly. But Ms. Varela, perhaps you could speak to the work plan impacts of this or options.
Thank you very much, Your Worship. So as per council protocol, if we put on a significant piece of work, something else has to come off, and we also have to resource appropriately. So there'd definitely be a discussion at the staff level that has to occur if this was to be planned for 2021. Alternatively, if this is something council wants to see in 2022 as an early piece of the budgeting process, we could certainly bring that forward as what kind of engagement program does council want, and then we could adjust work plans and request resourcing accordingly. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Rella, for that. Anything else, Councillor Appleton? Councillor Patterson?
Yes, thank you. I appreciate Councillor Zelka bringing the proposal forward. I realize the difficulty, and Councillor Appleton has spoken to it, but I do think that this is such a substantial piece of work and such a substantial request for support from the community for this piece that, and I appreciate what he said about the upland sewer separation. My God, there were workshops and display boards and tons of input and just so much discussion on that to really inform people. And I think a lot of useful feedback came out of that information. So I don't know if this means you hold a virtual town hall, or like as you said, Mayor, that it be done early in the new year. But I definitely would like to see a strong communication strategy developed around this piece. And so I don't know exactly what it will look like, but I appreciate that Councillor Zelka brought this forward because I do think it's important.
Thank you, Councillor Patterson. I have Councillor Ney online, and then I have Councillor Green and
Quickly, Mr. Mayor, I'm in line with where Councillor Appleton and Patterson would go, and I appreciate what Councillor Zelka is doing. Is that I would leave it in the hands of staff to come up with the communication plan, that includes engagement activities that are fitting for the scale of this and the significance of this project, and for staff to come back with recommendation. I wouldn't want to get locked in to do this one thing. I think it needs to be thought of as a more comprehensive communication plan, as per what Councillor Patterson was saying.
Thank you, Councillor Ney. Can I just get a motion to extend the meeting to 10:15? Moved, seconded. Any discussion? All those in favor? Opposed? None opposed. That carries. We are able to continue. Thank you for that. Thanks, Councillor Ney, Councillor Green, and then Braithwaite.
Yes, and I'll be really quick. I agree with everybody's comments. I think we do need to do a fulsome multi-pronged communication strategy for this project. And I would encourage staff to go back and look at the model that was used for uplands, because, I think the public generally deserve the same sort of level of engagement if it's possible. If it's not possible because of the provincial health orders, then I think we have to really work around that, but do the best we can under all the circumstances. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor. Go ahead,
I'll be
Councillor
very
Pickett.
short. Ditto.
What I'm hearing is a little bit of a consensus is to kind of is to look at this as an option. I would be very supportive of doing something. I note that the Uplands was really asking the people impacted by that decision, which had massive impacts on their homes, as to what their feedback was in terms of whether they put in a forced pump or gravity pump. It's a little bit different situation, but the cost issue is such a big one that I think it's really important. So I'm just wondering if it's the appropriate piece here, if this is wanting to be looked at a bit more fulsomely, then maybe we could refer this to the strategic planning piece, or but I'll go to Councillor Appleton.
If I might, Your Worship, maybe suggest a friendly amendment such that the motion be modified to indicate that staff be directed to provide options for a public engagement program centering on the asset management plan with costs and projections to be included in the upcoming strategic plan and budgeting process.
I'm very much open to friendly amendment in that direction.
I don't know if you wrote that down to repeat it, Councillor Appleton.
Try that again. Thank you, Your Worship. That staff be directed to develop a public engagement program, potentially including a town hall format to communicate the asset management plan, and that work be included in the upcoming strategic planning and budgeting process.
So I'm going to go to Mr. Councillor Zelka to see if he seconds that amendment.
Yeah, if the word town hall could be replaced with open house, I would definitely second that. Is that are you open to the friendly amendment?
Yeah, we'll just take it as made. Open house is fine.
All right.
I think at the end of the day, it'll come back with options and not being prescriptive at this point in any case. So
yes. Yes.
Okay, so that motion is live on the table. Any further discussion on that? Thank you very much, and thank you for the motion and the amendment. I think that's more in keeping with our process here of trying to look at these issues within the context of all the other challenges and time that staff have. So I appreciate that. If any other hands, I'll call the question. All those in favor? Any opposed? None opposed. That carries. Are there any other motions arising? I'm not seeing any. So with that, I will just, again, we've said it multiple times. I'll say it again. This has been a monumental amount of work to get us here, a lot of commitment from staff and council, and I think one of the examples of elected officials and staff working really closely together on shared goals. So it's a step in the process. Obviously, this is a living document that's going to live for many, many years and decades to come as we modify it and adapt it to climate change and other issues as they come. But what a great first step for us to kind of move forward with some shared knowledge base and shared understanding. So thank you for all the work that's gone into this, and thank you, Council, for supporting this process. And with that, I'd just like for a motion to adjourn. Oh, sorry, one more item on the agenda. Oh, I was being so hopeful. Sorry, my apologies to the people on 1701 Beach Drive. We have a development variance permit request for 1701 Beach Drive. Mr. Anderson, welcome back to the meeting.
I'll have Caitlin McDougall, our planner, introduce the application. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Welcome.
Thank you, Your Worship. Can you hear me okay?
We can.
Perfect. Okay. So before you for consideration is development variance permit number 00113 for Glen Lyon Norfolk School located at 1701 Beach Drive. The requested variance is with regards to bylaw number 3536, Screens and Fences bylaw, to increase the maximum permitted fence height from 2 meters to 6 meters for the purpose of securing an outdoor playground area at the school. The subject property is designated in the official community plan as community institutional and is located in the Prospect Heritage Conservation Area. The purpose of the proposed development variance permit application aligns with the intended use of the property, and the works proposed for this development variance permit are exempt from requiring a heritage alteration permit due to the fact that they do not require a building permit and do not alter the heritage protected features of the site. Now, the property is also located in the Watercourses Development Permit Area and the Shorelines Development Permit Area, and the proposed works do not trigger any development permit review. And then finally, the property is also subject to Land Use Contract Bylaw number 3219, which specifies the siting of structures on the site, and is also subject to Heritage Designation Bylaw number 3641, which recognizes the heritage value of select buildings and select features of the land. And similarly here, the proposed variance would not result in any activity that violates these bylaws, and so therefore no additional permits are required there. So just to go over really quickly the requested variance. So currently GNS occupies the subject property utilizing the heritage buildings and recent building additions for the school operations. The site was recently underwent some renovations in 2017. One of those improvements on the site included an enhanced play area located along the northern property boundary. And with that, mesh netting fence was erected for the purpose of securing that outdoor play area. Now, the impact of the new fence is primarily limited to the neighboring multifamily development to the north, located at 1725 Beach Drive. Increasing this fence height could potentially result in limited sight lines, lack of visibility, some shadowing or restricted views. However, all of these things have mostly been mitigated by the fact that the material selected for this fence is mesh and can basically be seen through for the most part. The fence appears to have no shadowing effect and only some minor effects on the view from the neighboring property. The height of the new fence is consistent with the previous chain link fence that was located in the same area of the property prior to 2017. So overall, staff consider the requested variance to be supportable. And at July 26th, which seems like so long ago now, Council directed staff to give notice of its intent to consider the development variance permit application. Notice was subsequently mailed to adjacent property owners within a 50-meter radius of the property, and with that, the planning department has only received one letter in support of the proposed DVP. So that's the summary there. We do have the applicant's representative here this evening as well, if there are any questions from council, and that's Christopher Rowe. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. McDougall. Go ahead, Councillor Braithwaite, then Green.
Thanks so very much, and thanks, staff, for the report. I note that there is one letter from Ms. Wallace-Prince, and in it she questions why there was no mention of the Prospect Heritage Conservation Area in the report, and then has a suggestion, I think, at the end of her letter that perhaps to help promote greater awareness, it says in the letter, of the Heritage Conservation Area, it's important that the existence and relevance in particular permit applications be duly recognized in reports. And I'm just wondering if that's something that perhaps staff can take note of and in the future perhaps includes this important area in their reports.
Thank you, Councillor Braithwaite. I know it was mentioned in the verbal overview provided by Ms. McDougall. Ms. McDougall, is this something that we can adapt into our reports going forward?
Absolutely, yeah. We would make sure to make note of that in all future reports for sure.
Thank you very much. Councillor Green.
Yes, thank you, Mayor. I'm prepared to make a motion. I will move the staff recommendation.
Moved and seconded. Thank you. Is there any other discussion on this? Go ahead, Councillor Appleton.
Thank you, Your Worship. I just wanted just a quick question. I think staff answered this when we considered sending out the DVP, but notification for residents within a 50-meter radius, did that make it to all the residents in the multifamily building, or was it sent to the property management company such that it could get sent to all of the residents in that building?
Thank you, Councillor Appleton. Ms. McDougall?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, all the neighboring multifamily units would have been included within that 50-meter radius, and I believe the applicant had indicated in pre-application discussions that there was also additional engagement between the applicant themselves and the residents, where they had kind of discussed the proposed fence or the fence variance. So that was also additional above and beyond our staff notification process.
Thank you.
Thank you. No other questions from council? One very quick question, Ms. McDougall. Does this approval approve the fence as designed? Are there any protections here to stop a solid wall from going up in future? Not that I expect that to happen, but just curious, when we approve a variance like this, is it tied to the transparency, et cetera, of the fence?
Yes, absolutely. So in the actual permit that gets released, if council does approve it, it basically specifies the design of this exact fence. So it wouldn't be extended to other fences on the property or for a different fence.
Very good. Thank you for that. We have a motion live on the floor. Any other questions? I'm not seeing any, so I'm ready to call the question. All of those in favor? Any opposed? None opposed. That carries. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Dougal, and to the applicants for that.
Move adjournment.
Move to adjournment. Moved and seconded. Thank you. All those in favor? Opposed? Not opposed? Everybody have a great evening, and we'll see you next week.